Hey guys, tonight we begin with a simple but unsettling truth. Most people are not who they seem. Not because they're lying, but because they're protecting something. Imagine this. Every conversation you've ever had was not just an exchange of words. It was a quiet negotiation of identity, fear, and acceptance. Behind every smile is a script. Behind every calm response, a calculation. And behind nearly every "I'm fine," a history that's been edited for safety. What if I told you that what you're hearing from others is often the mask, not the message? You're not crazy for feeling like something's missing in your relationships, like you're sensing one thing but being told another. That dissonance isn't paranoia. It's the quiet sound of someone hiding, and you already know it. You just haven't had the language to name it yet. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments, what city are you listening from and what time is it there right now? Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. They move through the world, carefully measured, each gesture curated, each word weighed before it escapes their lips. They laugh at the right moment, nod at the right points, and avoid topics that might reveal too much. And yet, if you pay attention, not just with your ears but with your sense of presence, you will notice something subtle. The shadow behind their eyes, the faint tightening of their shoulders, the imperceptible hesitation in their voice. These are the fissures of the persona, the quiet signals of a self that is managed, restrained, and hidden. Every person you encounter, from the closest friend to the fleeting stranger, carries this hidden self. It is not a secret for deception. It is a mechanism for survival. Everyone is hiding because the world often punishes authenticity, and survival depends on performance. From the earliest years, we learn the language of concealment. Perhaps you were 4 or 5 when you discovered it. Maybe you cried too loudly, asked too many questions, or demanded attention that someone else deemed excessive. The reprimand could have been as direct as a sharp word, a dismissive glance, or a cold admonishment. Or perhaps it was subtler, the silent withdrawal of warmth, the redirection of conversation, the quick acknowledgement of your presence, and then a return to what matters in the adult world. In that moment, the child learns a painful lesson, that some parts of themselves are unsafe. Some desires, fears, and emotions are not acceptable, and if exposed, they could trigger rejection, ridicule, or abandonment. It is then that the mask is born. Not as a malicious lie, not as an intentional falsity, but as a carefully constructed version of self designed for protection. This first mask is crude and imperfect but effective. It smiles when the real heart aches. It speaks in gentle, socially acceptable tones when anger simmers beneath the skin. It nods when disagreement is present, suppressing contradiction for the sake of belonging. And over time, the mask becomes more sophisticated. It learns the contours of social expectation, the scripts that elicit approval, the silences that prevent conflict. The child grows into the adolescent, the mask grows more elegant, more persuasive, more convincing, not just to the world but to the wearer themselves. Women, in particular, often learn this early instinctively. Society rewards compliance, rewards smiles, encourages patience, and prizes politeness. A girl who learns to suppress irritation, to temper disappointment, to absorb subtle dismissals without protest, becomes adept at the craft of invisibility. She smiles at the comments that sting, thanks those who belittle, nods at instructions she disagrees with, all in the pursuit of being acceptable, being seen, being loved. This mask is both armor and prison. It offers protection from the gaze of judgment, yet it constrains the fullness of expression, the raw, untamed self. The very traits that make her unique, her sharp intuition, her unfiltered curiosity, her spontaneous joy, These may be hidden behind a carefully orchestrated exterior. Nietzsche reminds us that every profound spirit needs a mask. And he is right. The mask is not a betrayal of self. It is, in its own way, a testament to intelligence and adaptability. It is a survival skill, honed over years of observation and practice, often at the cost of authenticity. The mask is the silent witness to every lesson of social negotiation, every unspoken compromise, every subtle compromise of desire for acceptance. It becomes fluent in the language of adaptation, capable of modulating emotions, controlling tone, and regulating gestures to match the expectations of the moment. Yet the mask has limits. Like armor that is too rigid, it begins to chafe. The longer it is worn, the more it presses against the contours of the soul, restricting freedom of movement and expression. Tension accumulates in small, almost imperceptible ways. A slight quiver in the voice when confronted with intimacy, a pause before answering a question that probes too deeply, a nervous laugh at something that should provoke anger. These micro-fissures reveal the underlying self, the true being that the mask attempts to conceal. The more meticulously the mask is maintained, the more fragile the core becomes, hidden behind layers of defense. And here lies the paradox. The very performance that ensures survival often creates alienation. People applaud the mask, admire its composure, trust its confidence, but they do not see the individual beneath. They love the version that is acceptable, digestible, safe, while the true self remains obscured, waiting for a moment of reprieve, a space where it might breathe. And sometimes that moment never comes. The mask is so embedded, so essential to survival, that even the wearer forgets it is a mask. They begin to identify with the persona, confusing it with their true self, and thus the distinction between authenticity and performance fades into a haze. Psychologists have identified several mechanisms underlying this masking. Projection, for instance, occurs when individuals externalize traits they find unacceptable in themselves, criticizing others for behaviors they secretly harbor. The colleague who condemns arrogance may be wrestling with deep-seated insecurity. The friend who mocks dishonesty may be confronting their own concealed fabrications. Observing these projections is a key to understanding the hidden self. Similarly, fawning, a trauma response involving excessive compliance or people-pleasing, manifests as a protective strategy against anticipated rejection or conflict. Both mechanisms demonstrate that behavior often speaks not of the reality of others, but of their fears and defensive imperatives. The mask also employs a sophisticated language of silence. What is left unsaid, carefully omitted, or strategically evaded frequently reveals more than the words that are spoken. Hesitation, vagueness, or rehearsed responses may signal discomfort, vulnerability, or avoidance. In some instances, silence is the loudest cry of fear, a way of signaling without exposure that certain truths are too dangerous to disclose. By tuning into consider the phenomenon of false confidence. A person may present as composed, articulate, and unshakable. They may appear to command respect, exude competence, and perform authority. Yet underneath there is often guilt, regret, or unprocessed pain. The composed exterior serves as a shield against scrutiny, a buffer against the anxiety of being exposed. Signs may include overpreparation, rigidity in social rituals, or defensiveness when challenged. Observing these cues allows insight into the fractures behind the facade, the human vulnerabilities that underpin every act of confidence. The modern world amplifies these dynamics. Social media, for instance, transforms the mask into a highly performative, curated persona. Individuals craft identities optimized for likes, shares, and approval. The louder the performance, the emptier the core, an aphorism that applies as much to digital spaces as to intimate social circles. Validation is sought not from genuine connection but from the acknowledgement of an audience, further distancing the individual from their authentic self. The persona becomes both armor and stage, offering safety while demanding perpetual performance. At the heart of this masking is the pursuit of acceptance. We all long to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be embraced in our vulnerability. The mask is a concession to reality, a bridge between inner truth and social expectation. It allows individuals to navigate complex social hierarchies, survive relational challenges, and maintain a semblance of peace in interactions that might otherwise be destabilizing. Yet, paradoxically, it can also perpetuate isolation as connection with the authentic self, and with others, is filtered through the lens of protection. Even so, awareness of the mask is transformative. Recognizing that everyone is hiding does not breed cynicism. It fosters empathy. When you see the performance not as deceit but as defense, your perception of others softens. You begin to understand that criticism, reticence, or performative virtue often emanates from fear, not malevolence. The angry colleague, the overly virtuous acquaintance, the compulsively agreeable friend, all of them are negotiating survival just as you are. This understanding invites patience and compassion, allowing for more measured responses and gentler judgments. And here is a final, profound insight. The mask is not merely about hiding from others, it is about hiding from ourselves. We deceive ourselves long before we deceive the world. The practiced mantra, the rehearsed story, the disciplined facade, all serve to shield us from confronting uncomfortable truths within. Recognizing the mask, then, is as much an act of self-reflection as it is a tool for understanding others. Every fissure you observe externally is also mirrored internally. They say that the eyes are windows to the soul, but perhaps the sharper windows are the judgments we cast upon others. Observe closely and you will notice a pattern. The characteristics a person most loudly condemns, the behaviors they denounce with fervor, often mirror the very truths they cannot bear to see in themselves. This is projection, a psychological mirror in which the traits one fears, despises, or refuses to acknowledge are reflected outward. It is not malice. It is self-preservation, an intricate dance between vulnerability and defense, played across the stages of human interaction. To read someone with depth, you must learn to follow the echo of their judgments, tracing the lines of their critique back to the shadowed corners of their inner world. Projection is subtle, insidious, and deceptively convincing. When someone mocks arrogance, questions honesty, or disparages emotional sensitivity, it is easy to dismiss it as mere opinion or moral preference. But consider, why does this particular flaw provoke such intensity? Why does the presence of this trait in others ignite agitation, discomfort, or contempt? The answer often lies not in the observed behavior itself, but in the unacknowledged resonance within the observer. Perhaps the critic harbors insecurities about their own self-worth, fears exposure of a hidden lie, or suppresses emotions they consider unacceptable. The hatred they express is a shield not against the world but against themselves. Imagine a woman who persistently criticizes her colleagues for being indecisive. She calls them weak, incompetent, or directionless. To the casual observer, this may appear as an emphasis on efficiency or leadership standards. But beneath the surface, there may exist a profound fear of her own indecisiveness, a dread of appearing uncertain or vulnerable in moments where she feels most exposed. By projecting disdain onto others, she temporarily distances herself from her own internal anxieties, creating a mental barrier that separates the discomforting self from her social identity. Projection, in this sense, is a defense mechanism, an adaptive strategy to maintain a fragile equilibrium between fear and performance. Similarly, consider the man who derides dishonesty in others, who becomes visibly uncomfortable or outraged at even minor lapses in truthfulness. On its surface, this may seem like a commitment to morality or integrity. Yet, beneath the indignation may lurk concealed deception, small lies told so frequently to oneself and others that they become indistinguishable from reality. By externalizing this criticism, he avoids facing the dissonance within, crafting a narrative in which moral superiority masks vulnerability. Projection operates quietly, but its consequences are far-reaching. It dictates relationships, influences judgments, and shapes perceptions in ways that the individual rarely consciously recognizes. What makes projection particularly challenging to perceive is its ubiquity and subtlety. Unlike overt deception, which can be verified or disproven, projection operates in the gray zones of emotion, cognition, and social behavior. It is woven into daily interactions. The annoyance at a friend's indecision, the impatience with a colleague's insecurity, the contempt for a partner's sensitivity. Each of these reactions is a breadcrumb, a subtle indicator of internal dissonance. The observer's task is to follow these breadcrumbs, to recognize that what irritates, frightens, or disturbs another often signals a suppressed truth about their inner self. From a Nietzschean perspective, projection is not a moral failing but a reflection of existential struggle. Life confronts us with limitations, vulnerabilities, and contradictions, and the ego is rarely equipped to face these truths directly. The persona, the carefully constructed mask we examined in Chapter 1, cannot tolerate the exposure of weakness or failure. It redirects the discomfort outward, displacing internal fear onto external targets. In this way, projection serves a dual purpose. It shields the self from awareness and simultaneously justifies the mask's continued existence. The individual condemns in others what they cannot integrate within, and by doing so, maintains a fragile sense of coherence. Women, in particular, navigate projection with unique social pressures. From a young age, many are conditioned to internalize expectations of comportment, beauty, and emotional regulation. A woman who fears her own assertiveness may unconsciously denounce assertiveness in others as aggression or selfishness. Another who struggles with envy may interpret admiration for others' achievements as narcissism or arrogance. These projected judgments are not accidental. They are protective strategies, honed by years of social conditioning, designed to preserve relational safety and self-esteem. By observing these patterns, one gains not only insight into the individual but also into the societal currents that shape behavior and perception. Projection often intensifies under stress or threat. When the self is under pressure, whether from professional scrutiny, relational tension, or existential uncertainty, the fissures of authenticity are exposed, and the mind seeks refuge in externalized critique. The more insecure the individual, the more vehement the projection. The louder the condemnation, the deeper the concealed fear. Recognizing this dynamic transforms one's perspective. What initially appears as antagonism becomes a signal, a coded message from projection is also intertwined with cognitive biases. The self-serving bias reinforces the tendency to externalize blame or negative traits. Individuals attribute positive outcomes to their own abilities while attributing negative outcomes or undesirable qualities to external factors, or in the case of projection, to others. Similarly, the fundamental attribution error causes observers to overestimate the dispositional causes of others' behavior while underestimating situational pressures. These biases create a feedback loop. The individual criticizes others for qualities they internally fear or deny, reinforcing their own self-image while deflecting attention from internal vulnerabilities. Recognizing this interplay is essential for a nuanced understanding of projection and its psychological mechanics. Projection is not limited to obvious traits or flaws. Often, it manifests in subtler domains: emotional regulation, moral judgment, or aesthetic preference. Someone who fears their own envy may consistently accuse friends of jealousy. Someone who struggles with guilt may see hypocrisy in others. Someone who doubts their own intelligence may deride others for being uninformed or naive. In all these cases, projection is a compass pointing toward unresolved internal tensions. The careful observer learns to follow the compass without judgment, tracing the projected traits back to their origin within the psyche. Another layer of projection involves moral and ideological domains. Consider social debates or political disagreements. People often react with intense indignation toward beliefs they perceive as morally corrupt or ideologically wrong. Yet often the intensity of this reaction correlates with their own unresolved doubts, fears, or contradictions. The zeal to correct, argue, or condemn is frequently less about the other person and more about self-defense. Understanding projection in this context illuminates not only individual psychology but also collective behavior, revealing how social groups externalize internal fears, anxieties, and insecurities through criticism, policing, or moralizing. Yet projection is not immutable. Awareness transforms it from a mechanism of unconscious defense to a tool of insight. By observing what others vehemently criticize, we gain a window into their inner world, the fears they harbor, the truths they deny, and the dimensions of self they have not reconciled. Equally important, projection invites reflection on our own lives. What do we react to most strongly in others? Which criticisms trigger disproportionate emotional responses? These questions reveal our own shadowed territories, the areas we hide from ourselves, and the fears that shape our judgments. In this sense, reading projection is both an external and internal practice, a dual lens through which we perceive human behavior and our own inner landscapes. Finally, it is essential to approach projection with compassion and humility. Observing another's projections is not an opportunity for exploitation or superiority. It is a call to grace, a chance to witness human complexity without condemnation. Every act of criticism, every pointed judgment, is a manifestation of a mind negotiating survival, managing vulnerability, and attempting to maintain equilibrium. By interpreting these behaviors empathetically, we cultivate understanding, patience, and moral elegance. The art of seeing what people project without judgment is the art of seeing them, and ourselves, more fully. So, the next time someone irritates you with an obsession, a complaint, or a pointed critique, pause. Ask yourself, what is this really about? What fear, insecurity, or unacknowledged truth might be at its root? Look beyond the surface into the fissures of their persona, and you will find a reflection of the human struggle, the tension between self-preservation and authenticity, between fear and courage, between the hidden self and the one we present to the world. Recognizing that projection is both universal and illuminating transforms judgment into insight, annoyance into empathy, and conflict into understanding. Projection is everywhere, in every interaction, every judgment, every irritation. It is the unseen architecture of human behavior, the quiet pulse beneath social performance. And when you learn to perceive it, you gain a skill no one teaches, a lens for deciphering motives, a method for connecting with the core truths of others without resorting to assumption or blame. Understanding projection does not make the world simpler, but it does make it richer, more textured, and infinitely more comprehensible. It is a tool for awakening, both to others and to oneself. Hey, as we continue, notice something peculiar. Not everything that is said holds equal weight. Words are tools, but silence is often the blade beneath the surface. In our conversations, in our casual observations, in the faint pauses that punctuate speech, the mind quietly leaves traces of truth. Silence is rarely empty, it carries weight, meaning, and intent. The person who hesitates before responding, who avoids certain topics, or who offers rehearsed, clipped replies, is telling you more than they realize. Here lies the paradox. Language can disguise, mislead, and inflate, but silence cannot. It confesses what the mask cannot conceal. The first thing to understand is that human beings are often performers first and speakers second. The persona, the mask discussed in previous chapters, exists to navigate society safely. It manages impressions, anticipates judgment, and rehearses acceptability. Words are part of this performance. They are carefully chosen, filtered, and sometimes sculpted to project competence, morality, or emotional composure. Yet, no matter how precise the language, the gaps between words, the hesitations, the changes in tone, the shifts in eye contact, betray the inner state. These gaps are the fractures in the performance, the cracks through which the unconscious leaks. Consider a moment in conversation when a seemingly confident colleague responds to a question about their mistakes. They give a concise, almost mechanical answer, nodding firmly, maintaining eye contact, but their tone subtly shifts. There is tension in their jaw, a pause that lingers too long. What is absent in these words is as telling as what is present. The silence before and after their reply reveals the unspoken weight of guilt, fear, or uncertainty. In these pauses, we witness the hidden truth, the internal struggle that the mask seeks to obscure. Modern psychology has multiple ways to explain this: microexpressions, body language analysis, or cognitive leakage. But the essential insight remains the same. Silence does not lie. Silence becomes particularly powerful when it is intentional or habitual. Some individuals speak sparingly, reserving words for necessity, avoiding personal disclosures. To the untrained eye, this might seem like introversion, prudence, or even aloofness. But the disciplined observer recognizes that these intentional silences function as a confessional in reverse. They reveal boundaries, vulnerabilities, and fears without uttering a single word. For example, someone who consistently avoids discussing their past relationships or career failures may appear composed, but their silence exposes an area of unresolved trauma or insecurity. Each evasion is a subtle admission, a truth too raw for verbal articulation. The key lies in noticing patterns over time, the moments when silence surfaces most prominently, and the emotional context that accompanies it. Nietzsche's insight is particularly useful here. Every profound spirit needs a mask. What he implies is that the depth of an individual's consciousness is often guarded not only by words but by calculated omissions. These omissions are deliberate shields against exposure. Yet, the very act of concealment creates a tension that is visible, tangible, and ultimately readable. Silence is a pressure point. It is a confession disguised as composure. The mask strains to maintain control, and in doing so, reveals the exact areas it is trying to protect. A careful listener learns to sense the weight of these unspoken admissions, understanding that what is not said often holds the key to understanding the person more than any carefully constructed speech ever could. The interplay between words and silence also illuminates the fear of judgment. Many humans fear vulnerability because exposure can bring ridicule, rejection, or humiliation. They craft stories, they rehearse their answers, they deliver narratives designed to impress or align with societal expectations. Yet, when confronted with deep or personal questions, they often pause, change the subject, or answer in minimalist phrases. The silence that fills these moments is both a defense mechanism and a confession. It whispers of discomfort, hesitation, and the fragile edges of self-assurance. To truly read someone, one must attend to these whispers, to the subtle cadences of restraint and avoidance. One classic example is the socially accomplished individual who presents themselves as confident and decisive. In group settings, they dominate conversation, offering opinions and advice with apparent certainty. Yet, when asked about a personal failure, a pause emerges. Perhaps it is a flicker of avoidance in the eyes, a hand that fidgets subtly, or a brief inhalation before a terse response. These micro-moments of silence betray a hidden self, the self that struggles with fear, shame, or doubt. The louder their performance in public, the more significant the silence when faced with private truths. This paradox, vividly observed in social psychology, is an essential tool for understanding human behavior. The volume of the mask inversely correlates with the transparency of the inner self. Silence also serves as a lens for empathy. In listening without interruption, without assuming, we allow the other person's gaps to speak. For instance, a friend who is grieving may not explicitly articulate their emotions, yet the cadence of their speech, the moments when words falter, reveal profound internal experiences. Similarly, a partner who avoids discussing conflicts may not be indifferent but overwhelmed, navigating fear of confrontation or internalized guilt. Recognizing these silent confessions fosters patience, compassion, and nuanced perception. We begin to read beyond narrative into the architecture of emotional reality. From a cognitive perspective, these silent admissions intersect with self-deception and projection. As we discussed in Chapter 2, people project fears and insecurities outward. When their mask is challenged, words are insufficient to maintain the facade. Silence emerges as a natural consequence. The persona cannot articulate a narrative that would fully align with internal contradictions. Instead, tension manifests in pauses, omissions, and careful wording. The same human mind. Additionally, the fear of social evaluation amplifies silent confessions. Research in social neuroscience suggests that humans are hypersensitive to perceived judgment. This sensitivity triggers subtle physiological responses, changes in breathing, microexpressions, pupil dilation, that are often unconsciously paired with silence. Someone may respond to a probing question with delayed speech, reflecting the internal debate, how much can I reveal without risking exposure? The silence itself becomes a narrative, a map of anxiety, an index of hidden truths. In this way, understanding silence transcends mere observation. It requires attentiveness, patience, and a willingness to witness the unspoken. A particularly revealing form of silence appears under moral or ethical pressure. When individuals are confronted with dilemmas, their initial words may be rehearsed or overly confident. Yet, the longer it takes them to respond, the more their hesitation unveils. Internal conflicts, moral uncertainty, or the fear of social repercussion. Nietzschean philosophy reminds us that human consciousness is layered and often contradictory. The silent moment is a window into these layers, a subtle acknowledgement of complexity and ambivalence that words alone cannot convey. Here, silence is not emptiness. It is confession, insight, and revelation. Consider also the role of cultural and gender dynamics. In societies that discourage emotional expression or penalize vulnerability, silence becomes a more pronounced indicator of internal states. Women, historically conditioned to suppress anger, assertiveness, or discomfort, may communicate volumes through strategic omissions. Men, socialized to mask insecurity with dominance, may reveal cracks through measured pauses. In both cases, silence functions as a confessional, transmitting the reality of the psyche without utterance. Observing these patterns is akin to reading the unspoken language of human survival. Subtle, complex, and deeply informative. Another dimension is the distinction between intentional silence and involuntary silence. Intentional silence may be used for strategy, diplomacy, or measured reflection. Involuntary silence arises from cognitive overload, emotional overwhelm, or fear of exposure. Both types reveal aspects of the hidden self, though they manifest differently. Intentional silence is disciplined. It signals control and consideration. Involuntary silence is revealing. It signals tension, conflict, or inner turmoil. The observer must differentiate these subtle variations to accurately interpret the unspoken narrative. Importantly, silence is rarely a standalone signal. It exists in dialogue with body language, tone of voice, and contextual cues. A pause combined with lowered gaze, a tremor in the voice, or subtle micro-movements communicates layers of meaning that words cannot capture. For instance, someone who answers confidently but exhibits brief moments of muscle tension may internally contradict their verbal claims. These contradictions, revealed through the interplay of silence and behavior, allow the perceptive observer to map internal landscapes with surprising accuracy. Finally, the moral application of this understanding cannot be overstated. Recognizing silence as confession provides not a tool for manipulation, but a lens for empathy. It reminds us that people are often performing, protecting, and negotiating complex internal realities. By attending to the unspoken, we cultivate patience, understanding, and the ability to respond with grace rather than reaction. To read someone in this way is to acknowledge the fragility, courage, and layered complexity of the human condition. Silence becomes not a void, but a bridge to authentic understanding, a key that unlocks the hidden chambers of experience that words alone cannot illuminate. So, the next time someone hesitates, pauses, or avoids a topic, resist the urge to fill the space. Lean into the quiet, observe with care, and let the silence speak. In these moments, the confessions of the soul emerge unbidden. They whisper fear, hope, doubt, and desire, the truths that language, rehearsed and filtered, would otherwise conceal. Learning to hear them is the essence of psychological insight, the skill no one teaches, and the doorway to seeing the human mind in its most profound, intricate, and authentic form. As we move forward in our journey of reading the hidden dimensions of human behavior, pause for a moment and consider this. Not all that glitters is gold, and not every smile of virtue reflects genuine goodness. Often, the people who loudly proclaim their morality, their correctness, or their unshakable sense of ethics are not necessarily paragons of integrity. Instead, their public display of virtue may conceal something far more complex. An unacknowledged desire for superiority, a craving for control, or a fear of inadequacy that demands constant validation. This is what we call the virtue trap, the paradox where moral posturing masks insecurity, and righteousness becomes a performance rather than a truth. At its core, the virtue trap is a form of psychological camouflage. The mask, as Nietzsche described, is not merely decorative. It is functional. In the case of the moral performer, their mask takes the form of amplified righteousness. They signal ethics and virtue not solely out of conviction but as a strategy to shape perception, to align social reality with their internal narrative of self-worth. By broadcasting their goodness, they position themselves above criticism, above challenge, and often above scrutiny of their own flaws. On the surface, this appears admirable. The words are noble, the actions seem altruistic. But beneath lies a subtle mechanism of control, a way to dictate social hierarchies and secure validation. Let's explore a classic scenario. Imagine a colleague in your workplace who consistently corrects others, points out ethical lapses, and frames every discussion around what is right. At first glance, they seem principled, perhaps even inspiring. But if we look closely, we may notice a pattern. Their interventions are performative, targeted, and often disproportionately emphasized. Their corrections are less about genuine guidance and more about establishing dominance, signaling superiority, or managing how others perceive them. This is the essence of the virtue trap. Morality as armor, ethics as strategy, and virtue as performance. Why does this occur? To understand, we must delve into the psychology behind moral exhibitionism. Human beings are inherently social creatures. Our survival has historically depended on belonging, reputation, and acceptance. Those who are perceived as morally upright often gain status, influence, and access to social capital. From an evolutionary perspective, Demonstrating virtue, whether genuine or performative, serves a function. It signals trustworthiness, reliability, and alignment with group norms. Yet, when this signaling becomes exaggerated, it reveals an underlying tension between self-perception and social aspiration. The louder the proclamation of goodness, the more likely there is a shadow of insecurity lurking beneath. Nietzsche's reflections on morality offer a lens here. He observed that morality is not always a reflection of an absolute ethical code but often a manifestation of the will to power in disguise. In other words, the insistence on moral superiority can be less about right or wrong and more about asserting control over the social environment. The moral performer seeks not only to appear good but to shape the moral landscape according to their vision, subtly guiding, judging, or constraining others. The virtue becomes a vehicle, a cloak, through which latent desires for authority and validation are enacted. We see this most vividly in moments of conflict. The moral performer often steps into debates with fervent insistence, appealing to higher principles, while simultaneously dismissing the perspectives of others. Their rhetoric is persuasive because it is couched in ethical authority, yet it carries a hidden agenda: to influence, to dominate, to assert that they are morally elevated. Silence or disagreement from their peers is often met with subtle reprimand or judgment, further consolidating their role as the arbiter of correctness. Psychologically, this behavior reflects a compensatory mechanism, a way to mitigate feelings of inadequacy, fear of rejection, or unresolved internal conflict. This phenomenon is not restricted to workplaces or public spaces. It extends into personal relationships as well. Consider a friend or partner who constantly emphasizes their generosity, patience, or moral rectitude. While their behavior may sometimes be genuine, the repetitive emphasis on these traits can indicate a preoccupation with perception rather than intrinsic character. The repeated signaling of virtue acts as a protective shell, ensuring that their moral identity is unquestionable, even if their emotional or relational vulnerabilities remain unexamined. Over time, this can create distance, as those around them sense the performance and may feel judged or subtly manipulated. An essential clue to identifying the virtue trap lies in observing discrepancies between public display and private action. When morality is authentic, it is integrated and consistent, expressed through behavior, empathy, and context-sensitive judgment. When it is performative, it is selective, rehearsed, and often accompanied by subtle attempts to elevate oneself above others. The person may offer unsolicited advice, highlight ethical breaches repeatedly, or express outrage disproportionately. These behaviors, when patterns emerge, reveal the gap between outward moral assertions and internal insecurities, the silent fractures beneath the mask. It is also instructive to consider the relationship between virtue signaling and fear of judgment. Human beings fear rejection and disapproval, and moral posturing provides a buffer. By projecting an image of ethical impeccability, the individual reduces perceived vulnerability. Mistakes become less visible, flaws less pronounced, and personal shortcomings less threatening. Yet, the paradox is that this very projection can intensify internal anxiety. The constant need to maintain moral performance consumes cognitive and emotional resources, creating tension, self-monitoring, and the risk of exposure. In other words, the mask that is meant to protect may simultaneously imprison, a dynamic that Nietzsche might describe as the tragic tension between power and fragility. Interestingly, virtue as a mask interacts closely with social reinforcement mechanisms. In the age of social media, performative morality is amplified exponentially. Public declarations of ethical stances, curated narratives of kindness, and visible acts of charity serve as signals to a wide audience, creating validation loops. Each like, comment, or share reinforces the mask, making it harder for the individual to access their authentic self. The louder the public virtue, the more profound the inner dependence on external approval, a subtle yet potent illustration of the virtue trap. The audience becomes both witness and enabler, validating a performance that may be only partially authentic. Yet, not all public displays of morality are performative. The critical distinction is motivation. Genuine virtue arises from internal alignment and ethical reasoning, whereas performative virtue emerges from social calculation and self-protective intent. The observer must learn to detect underlying drivers by analyzing behavioral consistency, emotional congruence, and responsiveness to critique or challenge. Someone who maintains ethical behavior even when unobserved, who listens empathetically without judgment, and who exercises discretion in moral discourse, is more likely acting from authenticity than performance. The virtue trap also illuminates a subtle form of psychological projection. Just as individuals project fears and insecurities in other contexts, the moral performer projects their internal struggle onto others. By highlighting others' faults, pointing out ethical lapses, or dramatizing moral indignation, they externalize their own anxieties about adequacy, fairness, and acceptance. The outward performance of righteousness is simultaneously an inward dialogue, a way to negotiate their insecurities, reaffirm self-image, and regulate emotional tension. Observing these patterns allows us to understand not just the behavior itself but the hidden mechanics of the psyche. From a philosophical standpoint, the virtue trap challenges our assumptions about morality. We are conditioned to associate visible ethical behavior with internal goodness, yet appearances can be misleading. Nietzsche's insight is stark. The pursuit of moral superiority may not elevate character. It may reveal a landscape of fear, self-interest, and unacknowledged desire for dominance. Here, the mask becomes both a guide and a warning. It signals intentions yet conceals deeper truths. Reading the mask requires careful observation, patience, and a willingness to look beyond surface-level impressions. Empathically, recognizing the virtue trap allows us to navigate human interactions with subtlety and grace. Instead of reacting to proclamations of morality with admiration or resistance, we can interpret them as signals, windows into underlying needs. We understand that the person is often negotiating internal fear, seeking affirmation, or asserting control, not necessarily with malice but with complexity. This perspective fosters compassion, minimizes misinterpretation, and allows for more strategic, humane engagement. Importantly, the virtue trap is a mirror for self-reflection. Ask yourself, when you display your own moral or ethical convictions, are they rooted in authenticity, or are they amplified for social validation? Do your assertions? Before we can truly read others, we must first recognize a universal truth about human psychology. People rarely deceive others first. They deceive themselves first. This is not a moral failing, nor an act of conscious cruelty. It is a survival mechanism, a silent, almost poetic defense against the discomforts of reality. Every lie we hear from someone else, the casual, "I'm fine," the rehearsed, "I don't care," the unconvincing "everything's okay," often originates not in the desire to manipulate, but in the desire to protect an already wounded self. In this chapter, we explore how self-deception forms, how it shapes behavior, and how recognizing it allows us to read the hidden currents of the human psyche. Imagine a child who learned early on that expressing sadness invited criticism, rejection, or neglect. To survive, the child crafted a narrative, a version of themselves that seemed untroubled, capable, and resilient. Over time, this narrative became internalized, a story they told themselves over and over until the lines between truth and protection blurred. They believed at some level that if they admitted vulnerability, the world would punish them. This early imprint creates the foundation of the lies we tell ourselves as adults, a subtle architecture of self-preservation that is rarely visible to others, and sometimes not even to the self. Self-deception, however, is not always dramatic. Often it manifests in patterns, scripts, and repeated phrases. Someone may tell themselves, "I don't need anyone," yet their actions reveal longing for connection. Another may insist, "I'm over it," even while recurring dreams or subconscious thoughts betray lingering pain. The paradox is striking. The more frequently a self-lie is rehearsed, the more it shapes perception, behavior, and reality. The ego begins to believe its own stories, embedding fiction into identity. These lies, far from being mere mistakes, become psychological poetry, carefully structured, protective, and hauntingly persistent. Understanding self-deception is essential for reading others, because it colors nearly every interaction. When someone tells you a version of themselves, pause and consider, did they first tell themselves this story to survive? For example, a friend who insists they are unbothered by criticism may, in fact, monitor every comment, inwardly rehearse rebuttals, and experience hidden tension. The words they speak are not lies in isolation. They are echoes of internal strategies that predate the conversation, rehearsed to soothe their own insecurities. Learning to detect these subtleties allows you to distinguish between the performance and the masked reality beneath. Nietzsche's insight resonates deeply here. Human consciousness is rarely transparent, and much of what we call identity is a carefully maintained narrative. The lies we tell ourselves first are the scaffolding upon which social performance is built. They enable us to interact without collapsing under the weight of unprocessed fear, shame, or guilt. Consider an individual who repeatedly proclaims independence. On the surface, they appear confident, self-sufficient, perhaps even admirable. Yet their insistence on autonomy may stem from an unresolved fear of reliance, a protective story rehearsed so diligently that it now defines their perceived character. Observing these contradictions is key to perceiving hidden truths. Self-deception leaks into speech, behavior, and choice, often revealing what is most guarded. Language itself becomes a tool for both protection and performance. Phrases like, "I'm fine," or "I don't care," are linguistic talismans, shielding vulnerability while creating an illusion of control. These repeated words become rituals, soothing internal anxiety while presenting a curated identity to the world. Yet, paradoxically, the very act of repetition strengthens their influence. The human mind, in its intricate architecture, begins to conflate repetition with reality. The lie solidifies as a belief. This is why those who appear most certain are often the ones wrestling with the most profound internal contradictions. By recognizing this, we gain access to a subtle, often invisible dimension of human behavior. The spaces between words, the tension behind rehearsed phrases, and the shadows that language cannot fully conceal. Another critical aspect of self-deception is its role in emotional regulation. Human beings are designed to avoid pain, and lies serve as an adaptive mechanism. By constructing an internal narrative that shields from discomfort, individuals maintain functionality in complex social environments. A student may convince themselves that failure is inconsequential. A partner may insist on being okay with distance or neglect. A leader may project unwavering certainty. These self-directed narratives act as internal stabilizers, preventing emotional collapse and preserving a sense of control. Yet, when these lies interact with the external world, they create patterns, predictable, interpretable, and revealing to a careful observer. Projection often accompanies self-deception, creating a double layer of obscuration. The traits or fears individuals cannot acknowledge in themselves are sometimes assigned to others. For instance, someone who tells themselves they are unselfish may be hypervigilant for signs of selfishness in peers, condemning behaviors they secretly recognize in themselves. Similarly, a person who believes they are unresentful may detect hostility or ingratitude in every interaction. The lies we tell ourselves first act as a prism, bending perception and altering social interpretation. To read others accurately, we must attend to these distortions, discerning the internal scripts that influence outward behavior. Furthermore, self-deception shapes decision-making and motivation. Choices are rarely made from pure rationality. They are filtered through internal narratives that justify, rationalize, or protect. Someone may decline opportunities, resist intimacy, or maintain rigid routines not because of objective obstacles, but because of self-directed lies that rationalize avoidance. A parent may overcompensate in work. The repetition of self-deception often creates behavioral fingerprints, patterns that recur across contexts. Consider phrases such as, "I'm fine," or "I don't care." Repeated enough, these become predictable markers. By observing frequency, context, and accompanying behavior, the informed observer can begin to decode the unspoken reality, where the individual's anxieties lie, what wounds persist, and what truths they are unwilling to face. These fingerprints are subtle yet consistent, much like the way a river carves its path in stone over centuries. The erosion is invisible moment by moment, yet undeniable in its enduring form. It is essential to acknowledge that self-deception is not inherently negative. On the contrary, it is adaptive, creative, and poetic, allowing survival, growth, and psychological continuity. Without it, the exposure to raw reality could be overwhelming. Yet, when these protective structures become rigid, they hinder authentic engagement, limit self-awareness, and obscure relational truth. The art of reading others, then, requires sensitivity to these delicate architectures. The lies we tell ourselves first are often the clearest window into the architecture of the soul. Self-deception also interacts with cultural and social conditioning. From early childhood, individuals internalize narratives about success, morality, and identity that may be partially fictional. These internalized lies are reinforced by social feedback, expectation, and normative pressures. A person may sincerely believe that independence equals worth, that control equals competence, or that stoicism equals strength. All narratives that simplify complexity, protect the ego, and facilitate social functioning. Yet, beneath these narratives, tension, contradiction, and suppressed emotion accumulate, leaking through subtle behaviors, pauses, and micro-expressions. Observing these leaks allows us to discern the internal mechanics of human behavior, giving us insight into the hidden landscape of motivation and fear. In relationships, self-deception frequently generates expectation-reality gaps. A partner who tells themselves, "I am unbothered by distance," may unconsciously seek connection in indirect ways, creating tension, confusion, or misinterpretation. A manager who insists, "I am impartial," may subconsciously favor those who mirror their internal narratives. These gaps reveal the dynamic interplay between narrative and action, protection and exposure, lie and truth. Understanding these gaps is a key skill in reading the hidden truths of human behavior. Patterns emerge not in what is said, but in how self-deception shapes choices, reactions, and priorities. Moreover, the lies we tell ourselves first often dictate perception of others. When someone convinces themselves of their own morality, resilience, or self-sufficiency, they may judge others harshly, projecting their internal scripts outward. Someone who believes they are fine may interpret another's vulnerability as weakness. Someone who convinces themselves they are independent may view interdependence as a threat. In this way, self-deception not only obscures internal truth but distorts social perception, creating a complex web in which reading others becomes an exercise in careful triangulation, observing words, behavior, and the subtle signals that betray the narratives they have internalized. The beauty of studying self-deception lies in its dual function. It is a mirror to others and to ourselves. By noticing where someone's words, actions, and behaviors misalign, we glimpse their internal masks. At the same time, we can interrogate our own patterns. Which phrases do we repeat? Which narratives have we internalized? And which truths have we quietly avoided? Nietzschean philosophy emphasizes self-awareness as liberation. By understanding the lies we tell ourselves first, we gain access to the mechanisms that shape all social interaction. This is not cynicism. It is clarity, compassion, and insight. In practice, to read someone effectively, attend to repetition, context, and the tension beneath speech. Ask not only what are they saying, but also, what have they told themselves so many times that it has become a truth? The answers reveal the architecture of fear, longing, and self-protection that underpins human behavior. Over time, patterns of self-deception become recognizable, allowing one to anticipate emotional responses, predict behavioral tendencies, and interpret motivations that remain unspoken yet deeply influential. Ultimately, the lies we tell ourselves first are the poetry of survival. They are not moral failings but adaptive narratives, shaped to shield. If you have ever encountered someone who seems impossibly confident, who dominates every conversation, who insists on reminding everyone of their accomplishments, take a moment and look closer. What you see is not always what it seems. The loud proclamations of superiority, the casual dismissals of others, the relentless drive to appear unshakable, these are rarely simple expressions of strength. More often they are a carefully constructed facade, a brittle shell concealing vulnerability so profound it cannot be faced openly. This is the paradox of arrogance. The more forceful the display, the more fragile the core. Arrogance is a psychological armor, a performance rehearsed and perfected over years. It begins, often invisibly, in childhood. A child who felt unseen, unworthy, or inadequate may discover early strategies to cope. Perhaps they overachieved to gain approval, mocked others to distract from their own insecurities, or cultivated a persona of fearlessness to hide trembling uncertainty. Over time, these survival mechanisms solidify into habits, rituals, and ultimately patterns of social behavior. The adult you see, brimming with apparent self-assurance, may in truth be a scared child wearing a crown. The superiority you witness is not innate. It is a mask, a shell, a self-soothing mechanism born of fear. Notice how arrogance manifests in everyday interactions. The overachiever who constantly references accolades, the colleague who dismisses ideas before hearing them, the friend who jokes at others' expense. These behaviors often signal an internal dialogue of inadequacy. Each sarcastic remark, each boast, is a rehearsal of control. By controlling perception, the individual convinces both themselves and the world that they are not fragile, that they are not fearful, that they are more than they feel inside. Every public display is an attempt to contain private chaos. Psychologically, this is not vanity in the simple sense. It is a compensation mechanism. When the inner self feels insufficient, the ego demands evidence of worthiness. Arrogance is the currency of this transaction, a way to trade performance for perceived security. The louder the display, the more precarious the foundation beneath it. The proudest person may also be the most anxious, the most defensive, and the most desperate to be seen as invulnerable. In a sense, arrogance is the visual echo of inner fear, a performance that whispers rather than shouts its true message. I am terrified of being insufficient, unworthy, unseen. Consider the contrast between authentic confidence and this performative arrogance. True confidence is quiet. It does not need constant validation. It does not dominate conversation or belittle others. Someone truly secure in their abilities moves without announcing their superiority. They do not need the approval of a crowd to feel complete. Arrogance, by contrast, is loud, conspicuous, performative. It is a signpost of insecurity, an outward signal of inward fragility. Arrogance also has a temporal element. In moments of pressure, when the performance is threatened, cracks appear. The dominant colleague may stumble over words, hesitate, or over-explain. The friend who always jokes may flinch at criticism or withdraw suddenly. These moments are instructive. They reveal the fractures beneath the surface, the spaces where vulnerability leaks despite careful rehearsal. Arrogance is, in this sense, a cracked shell, strong enough to appear whole from a distance, but fragile when closely examined. The developmental roots of this phenomenon are worth exploring. Children who experienced inconsistency, neglect, or harsh judgment often internalize the belief that their natural selves are insufficient. To survive, they cultivate compensatory behaviors, overachievement, self-aggrandizement, superiority displays, that allow them to navigate social landscapes safely. As adults, these behaviors are rehearsed automatically. Arrogance, in this frame, is less a choice than a deeply embedded coping strategy. It is a self-soothing script. By presenting an impenetrable exterior, the individual reassures themselves, moment by moment, that they are worthy, that they are strong, that they are enough. Yet, while arrogance shields, it also isolates. The very behaviors designed to command respect, admiration, or fear often create distance. Colleagues may avoid collaboration, friends may hesitate to engage, and observers may detect a subtle tension that discourages intimacy. The arrogant individual may be admired superficially, but true connection is scarce. This is the irony of the cracked shell. It protects against perceived threats, yet simultaneously blocks genuine relational warmth, leaving the person perpetually at a social remove. Arrogance is also intimately tied to projection. The traits the arrogant person criticizes in others often reflect qualities they deny or fear within themselves. A leader who harshly condemns weakness may secretly fear their own inadequacy. A peer who mocks humility may struggle to accept their own limitations. By externalizing internal conflicts, the individual maintains a sense of control and distance from the very fears that drive them. The cracks in arrogance reveal not cruelty or malice, but a mirror of hidden vulnerability. In modern social contexts, especially with social media amplifying performance, arrogance has taken on new dimensions. The curated persona, the highlight reel of achievement, the constant comparison, all reinforce the cracked shell. Public admiration becomes a form of validation. Likes and comments function as psychological scaffolding, and the performance is amplified for maximum visibility. Yet the underlying fragility remains unchanged. The louder the persona, the more tenuous the internal foundation. The observer who recognizes this can see beyond the spectacle, identifying the subtle leaks of fear and insecurity hidden beneath polished exteriors. Even body language offers clues. Arrogance is often accompanied by tension, a stiff posture, clenched jaw, rapid speech, or exaggerated gestures. These signals betray the effort required to maintain the mask. The outward display of dominance is counterbalanced by inward vigilance. Every word, glance, and movement is monitored, rehearsed, and corrected. The shell is cracked precisely because sustaining it demands constant attention. Every small inconsistency is a fissure through which vulnerability can escape, visible to those who know where to look. Nietzsche's insight here is striking. Human beings construct identities as protective mechanisms, but these constructions are rarely perfect. Arrogance is a classic example, a shell that promises invulnerability yet conceals inner chaos. Understanding this allows you to read not only the behaviors of the arrogant but also the psychological logic that sustains them. The proudest declarations often encode the deepest fears. The most dominant postures often compensate for feelings of insufficiency. The loudest voices often speak for the silent anxieties that no one else can see. Empathy, however, transforms this understanding from judgment to insight. Recognizing arrogance as a cracked shell does not mean condemning it. It means seeing the child behind the crown, the vulnerability beneath performance, and the survival strategy masquerading as superiority. This perspective allows for compassion while maintaining clarity. It enables you to navigate social interactions with precision, understanding that beneath the surface aggression or boastfulness lies a familiar human need to feel safe, valued, and recognized. To read arrogance effectively, pay attention to context and consistency. Observe how the individual responds to challenges, criticism, or failure. Notice the interplay between words and body language. Consider what is being defended, exaggerated, or projected. The cracks are there, subtle yet persistent. They tell the story the words cannot, revealing the internal dynamics of fear, self-soothing, and protective strategy. Arrogance also informs relational dynamics. Individuals with cracked shells often engage in competitive positioning, subtle undermining, or overcompensation in social hierarchies. Their need to assert dominance or superiority is a protective measure, a way to control perception and avoid exposure of internal fragility. Yet, paradoxically, the behaviors that secure short-term recognition can exacerbate long-term insecurity, creating a feedback loop of performance and fear. The shell must be constantly reinforced, the performance continuously polished, and the cracks continually masked. Understanding this dynamic allows you to differentiate between surface behavior and underlying need. The arrogant colleague, friend, or leader is not simply self-centered or insensitive. They are navigating a world in which vulnerability feels dangerous. Their performance is adaptive, though imperfect. Recognizing the child within the shell illuminates their motivations, softening judgment and enhancing strategic empathy. Finally, the lesson extends inward. Arrogance is not solely an external phenomenon. We all carry forms of cracked shells. When we overcompensate, exaggerate, or perform superiority, we participate in the same cycle. Awareness of these patterns enables self-reflection, growth, and the dismantling of our own fragile defenses. By seeing the cracks in others, we can recognize the cracks within ourselves, cultivating a deeper honesty, resilience, and relational authenticity. Arrogance, therefore, is both a warning and a guide. It signals the presence of fear beneath performance, reveals patterns of self-protection, and offers a window into the intricate psychology of the human mind. By observing carefully with both insight and compassion, we can decode the cracks, understand the motives, and connect with the vulnerability that all humans share. Behind every boast, every display of superiority, every loud proclamation, there is a hidden child seeking reassurance, a fractured shell that longs for safety, and a human being negotiating survival through the language of performance. Understanding this is essential to Nietzsche's. Have you ever paused to consider why people do what they do? Not what they claim to want, but what their actions actually reveal. On the surface, behaviors often appear motivated by ambition, curiosity, or desire. We see someone taking initiative, dominating a meeting, or relentlessly pursuing a goal, and we assume a story of aspiration. Yet, Nietzsche's insight whispers a deeper truth. The hidden author of most human actions is fear. Fear is not a minor character lurking in the background. It is the silent, relentless writer shaping every scene, every line, every gesture. The human mind is a remarkable survival engine. From early childhood, we are conditioned to navigate social hierarchies, emotional landscapes, and environmental threats. Our ancestors faced physical dangers, while modern humans face psychological and social perils. Rejection, humiliation, loss of status, or the erasure of identity. Fear, subtle and pervasive, becomes a blueprint for action. What looks like courage is often a mask. What appears as ambition is often a strategy to preempt abandonment. What seems like passion is frequently a method to control uncertainty. The visible narrative is desire, but the invisible hand is fear. Take, for example, the colleague who dominates conversations. At first glance, their assertiveness appears proactive, confident, even inspiring. But a careful observer notes patterns. Interruptions, insistence on agreement, over-explaining, or hyper-rational justifications. What drives this behavior is not pure self-expression. It is the fear of being dismissed, ignored, or misunderstood. Each word is chosen not merely to communicate but to protect, to preempt a threat, to stave off vulnerability. Their outward boldness masks an inward trembling, a deep, often unspoken fear of irrelevance or inadequacy. Fear also manifests as a compulsion to control outcomes. The parent micromanaging every detail of a child's life, the manager directing every minor project step, the friend orchestrating every social encounter. All these behaviors are not signs of strength or omniscience. They are echoes of an internal disorder, a chaotic inner world that demands external order. The desire to dominate is born of panic, a fear that if the outer world is allowed to run free, the inner world will collapse. Every effort to control, organize, or predict is a silent confession. I am terrified that without my intervention, all will fall apart. Consider social behaviors as well. People often conform, overachieve, or compete not because they intrinsically crave approval, but because the fear of failure, embarrassment, or rejection is unbearable. High achievers frequently report that their drive was less about inspiration and more about anxiety, fear of being deemed worthless, invisible, or incompetent. Even acts of generosity, charm, or networking can have a shadow motivation, the fear of isolation. This is a delicate yet powerful truth. The engine of behavior is often avoidance, not pursuit. What we think of as desire is frequently the shadow of avoidance, the dance of escaping what terrifies us. The implications of recognizing fear as the real author are profound. It shifts perception from judgment to curiosity. When someone acts aggressively, manipulates, or dominates, the immediate impulse may be to label them as selfish, cruel, or overbearing. Yet, if you read fear into their actions, the story changes. The aggressor is a person terrified of loss. The manipulator is trying to prevent chaos. The domineering leader is shielding a vulnerable self. Fear reframes behavior as a language of survival, revealing underlying motives rather than surface appearances. Even seemingly positive traits, confidence, decisiveness, charm, often contain subtle traces of fear. The public speaker who performs flawlessly may rehearse not only for clarity but to mask anxiety about judgment. The social connector who maintains constant visibility may be avoiding loneliness or irrelevance. The entrepreneur who takes bold risks may be propelled by the dread of stagnation more than by vision. Fear is, in this sense, not only a reactive force but a creative one. It orchestrates strategies, scripts responses, and shapes identity, all in service of survival. Nietzsche's lens provides additional insight. He reminds us that humans construct masks, personas carefully designed to navigate life safely. The mask is often misread as desire. The inner drives of ambition, charisma, or dominance are interpreted as proactive energy. But the mask itself is a defensive construct against fear. The child who learned early that expressing weakness invites ridicule grows into the adult who performs strength at all costs. The student who feared failure transforms into the overachiever who chases every grade, accolade, and recognition. Fear authors the narrative long before conscious choice intervenes. Psychologists call this phenomenon behavioral avoidance, but the subtlety lies in its invisibility. People rarely admit that fear governs them. They justify actions with rationalizations. I did it because I wanted to, or I pursued this opportunity out of passion. Yet when the behavior is analyzed, patterns emerge. Avoidance of scrutiny, overcompensation for perceived deficiencies, or strategic control of environments. Fear is not only a hidden driver but an author working behind the curtain, scripting responses that look like ambition but are fundamentally protective. Fear also interacts with projection, compounding its influence. A person may criticize another's indecision, arrogance, or impulsivity, but the critique often reflects their own fears. The overachiever despises laziness because they fear being judged insufficient. The manipulator condemns deceit because they fear exposure. The domineering leader mocks vulnerability because they fear helplessness. Fear writes both the behavior and the commentary on others, weaving a tapestry where every outward act is a reflection of inner anxiety. In relational dynamics, this principle illuminates recurring patterns. Partners, friends, or colleagues frequently react not to the world objectively but to imagined threats. Conflict is rarely purely rational. It is often triggered by fear. Fear of abandonment, rejection, invisibility, or humiliation. Understanding that fear authors' behavior shifts perception from irritation or judgment to interpretation and empathy. You begin to see the silent script, the invisible hand that drives reaction. Even courage is illuminated through the lens of fear. True courage is not the absence of fear but the conscious engagement with it. Many who appear bold are in fact skilled at masking their fear, channeling it into performance. The heroics we admire often have fear at their root, a calculated navigation of danger, anxiety, and uncertainty. Fear, paradoxically, is both the obstacle and the fuel. It terrifies yet motivates, constrains yet inspires. Consider everyday life. Fear authors your decisions about social presentation, professional negotiation, or personal vulnerability. The decision to speak up, remain silent, compete, or retreat is rarely purely rational. Fear shapes the probability calculations, the energy allocation, and the timing of every move. Even acts of generosity, risk-taking, or innovation may be rooted in the subtle dread of loss of relevance, status, or security. In this light, the human narrative is less a story of desire than a story of evasion, a continuous choreography orchestrated by fear. Modern life amplifies this dynamic. Social media, professional hierarchies, and competitive landscapes heighten the perception of threat. Comparison intensifies anxiety, judgment magnifies insecurity, and performance becomes the default mechanism of survival. Each post, each statement, each carefully curated persona is a response to fear, an attempt to navigate a world perceived as unforgiving. Fear authors behavior invisibly, yet its fingerprints are everywhere. In overachievement, in self-presentation, in relational negotiations, in subtle power plays. Empathy transforms this awareness into a tool for relational insight. Recognizing fear as the real author allows one to interpret behavior without default judgment. The colleague who overcorrects is not malicious, they are anxious. The partner who withdraws is not uncaring, they are afraid. The friend who dominates conversations is not egocentric, they are protecting their self-worth. Fear reframes actions as messages, offering clarity and depth. Understanding becomes a moral responsibility, an exercise in perceiving humanity beneath performance. Observing fear also guides self-reflection. We each carry scripts authored by fear, behaviors we justify, reactions we rationalize, patterns we repeat. When we recognize the invisible hand writing our decisions, we gain the capacity to respond consciously rather than react automatically. Fear is no longer a dictator. It becomes a guide, a signal, a map of where unresolved vulnerabilities reside. Through this lens, Nietzsche's psychological truths reveal not only others but ourselves. The masks we wear, the scripts we perform, the reactions we execute, all bear the signature of fear. In conclusion, fear is the quiet author behind the narrative of human behavior. It scripts ambition, directs performance, colors interpersonal dynamics, and underpins every mask we wear. The seeming desires, bravado, and assertiveness we encounter are often strategies to avoid the abyss of uncertainty, invisibility, or loss. By observing carefully, interpreting with empathy, and considering context, one can decode these actions, seeing not just the performance but the author behind it. To see fear as the author is to read the invisible ink of human psychology. It transforms our perception, turning confusion into clarity, irritation into understanding, and judgment into compassionate insight. In the cracks, hesitations, and overreactions, the real story is written. Have you noticed how easily people turn into critics? How quick we are to dissect, condemn, or ridicule the choices of others. We comment on their lifestyle, their looks, their relationships, their failures, and their ambitions, as if we were born arbiters of what is right, worthy, or acceptable. But what if I told you that criticism is rarely about the other person? That behind every harsh judgment is a trembling shadow, a fragment of ourselves we've rejected, denied, or hidden so deeply that we only dare to confront it when it wears another's face. Nietzsche once wrote that all philosophy is a confession in disguise. But perhaps more universally so is all criticism. Every accusation we fling outward is, in some form, an echo of an internal war. A protest not against someone else's flaw, but against the reflection we see, and fear, in their imperfection. The truth is as uncomfortable as it is liberating. What we cannot accept in others is often what we cannot accept in ourselves. Criticism, in its most habitual form, is not an intellectual act. It's not the result of detached reasoning or moral clarity. It's an emotional reflex, a shield the ego raises to protect us from the sting of self-recognition. Imagine a person who constantly criticizes others for being too emotional. Every tear they witness, every trembling voice, every raw confession makes them visibly uncomfortable. They label it weak, dramatic, or manipulative. But dig deeper and you'll often find someone who was once punished for their own emotions. Someone who was told to grow up, get over it, or stop crying. Someone whose softness was never welcomed, only silenced. So they learned to armor themselves in indifference. And now, when they see someone displaying the very vulnerability they buried, it touches a nerve. It's not the emotion they hate, it's the reminder. Criticism becomes a mirror, a way to project internal discomfort onto the world so we don't have to turn inward. To criticize is to say, that is not me, when in fact some part of us knows it is, or was or could be. Psychologists call this projection, but Nietzsche understood it long before the term was coined. He saw that the human psyche, in its fragile brilliance, often avoids self-confrontation by externalizing its conflicts. Projection is elegant in its deception. It allows the critic to feel morally superior while avoiding their own shadows. It's the man who condemns dishonesty while lying to himself about the state of his marriage. It's the woman who mocks other women for being attention-seeking, while nursing a deep, unmet need to be seen. It's the friend who scorns arrogance while secretly resenting their own invisibility. Here's the twist. Projection always chooses targets that feel close to home. We don't project onto the alien or irrelevant. We project onto those whose behaviors trigger an internal familiarity, a resonance with something unresolved within us. When you start to see criticism as confession, you begin to decode the hidden autobiography behind people's judgments. Every rant, every eye roll, every unsolicited opinion becomes a breadcrumb trail leading back to their unhealed places. Criticism often masquerades as confidence. It speaks in strong tones, righteous phrasing, and blunt declarations. But listen carefully, and you'll hear the tremor beneath the certainty. You'll hear someone trying to convince themselves as much as you. Take the colleague who constantly critiques others' ideas in meetings. They may appear sharp, incisive, in control, but their pattern betrays a deeper fear. Fear of being outshined, dismissed, or proven irrelevant. So they strike first. They assert dominance through deconstruction. They attack not to enlighten but to protect. Or consider the parent who endlessly points out a child's flaws, their posture, their habits, their choices. It's not always cruelty. Sometimes it's a displaced anxiety, a fear that their child will suffer the same failures they never overcame. So they criticize in the name of guidance, but what they're really trying to fix is a younger version of themselves, now living outside their body. Criticism becomes a performance of control, a way to mask helplessness with precision. And the louder the performance, the deeper the void it's trying to fill. There's a reason certain people trigger us more than others. Why one person's lifestyle feels like a personal insult. Why someone else's confidence feels like arrogance. Why their choices feel like threats. It's because they show us what we've suppressed. They mirror back the parts of ourselves we've been taught to silence. The sensuality, the spontaneity, the ambition, the rage, the neediness, the softness, the madness. When someone embodies what we've disowned, it doesn't inspire, it threatens. It reminds us that we once wanted those things too, until the world told us we weren't allowed. So we turn the mirror into a weapon. We say, she's full of herself, when what we mean is, I wish I had that kind of unapologetic self-worth. We say, he's too much, when we mean, I've spent my life trying to be less. Criticism then becomes a kind of exile. We push others away because they remind us of the places we've abandoned in ourselves. To truly read someone, listen to what they hate, and ask why. Don't take criticism at face value. Reverse engineer it. Trace the emotion back to the pain. Look for the disproportionate response. Look for the patterns. If someone is obsessed with calling out liars, ask, who lied to them? If they constantly ridicule those who are ambitious, ask, when did they learn to play small? If they mock others for being needy, ask, who shamed them for needing love? Every attack is a roadmap. Every judgment is a compass pointing to a hidden wound. Nietzsche understood this when he said, distrust all in whom the impulse to punish is powerful. Because behind the punisher is often the punished. The one who was never allowed grace now struggles to offer it. The one who was not forgiven becomes addicted to blaming. To listen backwards is to hear not what someone says, but what they're really trying to unsay. Let's not demonize the critic. Most people don't even realize they're doing it. They're not evil, they're injured. Criticism often begins as a survival strategy. For some, it's a way to gain power in environments where they felt powerless. For others, it's a way to belong, bonding with others through shared judgment. For many, it's a method of deflecting attention from their own imperfections. But over time, this habit becomes a prison. The critic becomes trapped in a cycle of projection and disconnection. They lose the ability to be soft, to be surprised, to be vulnerable. They forget that the world is not a courtroom. Not everything needs a verdict. And perhaps worst of all, they turn that criticism inward. Because eventually the mirror swings back. The person who judges everyone else begins to judge themselves. Ruthlessly. Relentlessly. They hear the voice they used on others now speaking inside their own mind. And it doesn't show mercy. So how do we break this pattern? How do we disarm the critic without silencing truth? The answer begins with curiosity. Curiosity softens judgment. It shifts us from what's wrong with them to what happened to them. It allows us to see behavior as data, not as an indictment. And with curiosity comes compassion. Not the passive kind, but the fierce kind. The kind that looks at someone's bitterness and says, you must have bled somewhere to become this sharp. Compassion doesn't excuse harm, but it explains it. It reveals the architecture behind the walls. And perhaps most radically, compassion invites self-reflection. It asks, where have I done the same? What parts of me have I exiled? Who do I criticize and why? Because the only way to read others deeply is to read yourself first. Criticism teaches us two things. 1. What others are afraid to face. 2. What we are afraid to feel. If you really want to grow, not just intellectually but emotionally, you must be willing to look at your judgments and ask, what is this protecting me from? Maybe it's protecting you from grief, or shame, or powerlessness. Maybe it's protecting you from wanting something you were told you shouldn't. But once you see the truth behind your criticism, something beautiful happens. You reclaim your lost self. You stop outsourcing your shame to others. You stop needing to win by making others lose. You stop projecting your pain onto strangers. And you begin to offer what the world truly needs, not more opinions but more understanding. Because the truth is we're all fighting shadows. We're all hiding parts of ourselves. And every time we criticize someone, we have a chance to ask a deeper question. What part of me is crying out to be seen? At first glance, confidence appears to be an effortless light, illuminating rooms, commanding attention, and guiding others through uncertainty. A confident person seems unshakable, as if life's tempests cannot touch them. They move with purpose, speak with clarity, and make decisions that seem absolute. Yet appearances are rarely what they seem. Beneath that calm, that assured exterior, there often lies a hidden storm. A storm of guilt, lingering shame, and quiet regret. What the world perceives as strength may, in fact, be a mask, meticulously crafted to hide vulnerabilities too raw to reveal. Confidence, in its most performative form, is not simply an outward expression of capability. It is a veil, concealing a history of wounds, errors, and moral reckonings that have never been reconciled. Imagine walking through a grand hall, each wall polished to a reflective sheen, every surface carefully aligned, every ornament precisely placed. From the outside, the hall appears perfect, flawless. Yet step closer and you notice faint cracks along the walls, subtle discolorations in the paint, hidden flaws in the floorboards. The grandeur is a facade. Beneath the surface lies imperfection meticulously concealed. Human confidence often functions in the same way. The poised individual, commanding the room with a calm demeanor, may be navigating a labyrinth of internal unease. Each gesture, each word, each decision is rehearsed not only to impress others, but to prevent exposure of past regrets, unresolved guilt, and private shame. Nietzsche might argue that the will to appear strong is intertwined with the will to conceal, that every confident persona is at once a declaration and a shield, a beacon and a barrier. Guilt is rarely loud. It moves quietly, in the spaces between words, in the pauses before a response, in the meticulous attention to detail that seems almost obsessive. It manifests in punctuality, perfectionism, and relentless preparation. The colleague who always arrives early, the friend who remembers every small detail, the leader who double-checks every decision. These are not merely habits of efficiency. They are subtle efforts to manage reality so that past mistakes, moral missteps, and moments of failure do not re-emerge to disturb the carefully maintained equilibrium. Even generosity, calm composure, or unwavering reliability may mask a fear of having been inadequate in the past, a remorse that continues to echo through decisions made long ago. Each polished exterior is a testament to survival, a testament to the human capacity to create order in response to inner chaos. Consider the executive lauded for their decisiveness, the one whose judgment is rarely questioned. They appear certain, commanding respect effortlessly. Yet behind closed doors, long after the boardroom lights dim, they may lie awake, revisiting choices, replaying moments where moral compromise or oversight caused harm. The parent, always calm and controlled, may privately grapple with guilt over moments they believe they failed their children, moments of impatience or absence that linger like shadows. Confidence in these cases is not merely a social currency. It is a coping mechanism, a way to assert control over what was once uncontrollable, a way to construct a narrative that allows them to exist without collapsing under the weight of self-reproach. What makes this dynamic particularly fascinating is the paradoxical relationship between confidence and guilt. The more polished and assured the outer self appears, the deeper the internal fissures may run. A confident person may appear untouchable precisely because they have learned, often through trauma or repeated mistakes, how to anticipate challenges, manage perceptions, and construct a persona that shields them from scrutiny. Every compliment received, every recognition earned reinforces this performance, creating a feedback loop. External validation soothes internal guilt temporarily, yet the mask becomes more necessary, the performance more intricate, and the reliance on outward approval more intense. The confident person may not always distinguish between who they are and who they appear to be, blending the mask and the self until they are inseparable. Subtle behavioral cues betray this inner struggle. Micro-expressions of tension, a slight rigidity in posture, hesitation before answering certain questions, avoidance of particular topics, all hint at the presence of hidden guilt. The perfectionist tendencies, the obsessive attention to detail, the need for constant control, are not merely quirks or habits. They are signs of a psyche negotiating with itself, striving to reconcile who it has been with who it is expected to appear as. Confidence, in these cases, is a carefully maintained equilibrium, a delicate balancing act between the desire to be seen as competent and the fear of exposure. The more controlled the external demeanor, the more acute the awareness of what must remain unseen. Guilt is not inherently destructive. It drives reflection, accountability, and empathy. The executive haunted by past mistakes may make decisions with greater care. The parent attentive to past errors may cultivate deeper presence and patience. The teacher aware of personal lapses may guide students with humility. When acknowledged and understood, guilt can transform into a guiding force, motivating ethical action and self-improvement. Yet unacknowledged, it becomes compulsive performance, a relentless striving for an unattainable perfection, an endless rehearsal designed to conceal flaws from the world and, crucially, from oneself. Social dynamics exacerbate this phenomenon. Society rewards appearances of competence, stability, and control. Those who maintain composure under pressure are praised, admired, and entrusted with responsibility. This external reinforcement encourages the mask to harden. Over time, the confident exterior may become more convincing than the inner reality. Each success reinforces the necessity of the facade, creating a cycle wherein the confident persona exists to maintain approval, while the internal self quietly negotiates guilt, shame, and regret. Nietzsche's insight that appearances can conceal profound truths is especially relevant here. Confidence is often a reflection not of unshakable certainty, but of meticulous self-defense. Understanding this allows for a nuanced perspective on human behavior. Confidence is not a singular attribute. It is a complex interplay between strength, fear, and concealment. To read someone beyond the surface, one must observe inconsistencies between words and actions, detect subtle tension in otherwise composed gestures, and notice patterns of over-preparation or control. The confident mask may leak under pressure. Stressful circumstances, unexpected questions, or moral dilemmas often reveal the fissures beneath. Compassionate observation allows one to perceive the human being behind the performance, to recognize that what seems like unshakable composure may, in fact, be a finely tuned adaptation born of experience, fear, and self-preservation. Moreover, the awareness of guilt-based confidence reflects back on the observer. Recognizing these patterns in others prompts introspection. Where do we ourselves perform? Where do we rehearse interactions, polish behaviors, or avoid vulnerability? The mirror of observation illuminates the mechanisms within our own psyche. To confront these tendencies requires courage, vulnerability, and self-compassion. True confidence is not merely the absence of fear, it is the capacity to exist authentically despite it. The confident person, when understood in this way, is not merely a model to emulate, but a mirror for our own navigation between guilt and authenticity. Ultimately, the journey of reading confidence as a mask of guilt is not about judgment. It is about perception, empathy, and insight. Words are more than mere vessels for meaning. They are instruments of the psyche, subtle indicators of the mind's hidden contours. When a person speaks, the language they choose often illuminates the architecture of their inner world, revealing fissures that are otherwise imperceptible. Notice the individual who speaks in absolutes: always, never, everyone, no one. There is an urgency in such words, a sharpness, a kind of relentless rhythm that hints at an anxiety beneath the surface. Extremes, in the language of the mind, function as volume controls for fear, amplifying the unspoken uncertainties that the speaker cannot yet confront. The louder the claim, the more one begins to suspect that somewhere beneath the polished exterior, there is tremor, hesitation, and a fracture in the very foundation of certainty. Consider the person who insists they never make mistakes, who proclaims with conviction that they always act rationally, who categorizes experiences in black and white terms. On the surface, this appears to be admirable clarity, a testament to discipline and intelligence. Yet, when we listen more closely, when we observe the cadence of their speech, the meticulous punctuation of their sentences, the subtle defensiveness that creeps into their tone, the facade begins to crack. Extreme language often masks deep insecurity. The mind, in its effort to stabilize chaos, resorts to absolutes as a form of containment. Saying "I never fail" is not merely a statement about reality, it is a protective shield against the possibility of acknowledging imperfection, vulnerability, or shame. It is an armor forged from fear, and while it may seem impenetrable, it subtly reveals the fissures it conceals. Extremes serve as a mirror for inner imbalance. The individual who declares, "I will never love again," is often someone who has loved too deeply and suffered too profoundly. The hyperbolic "never" is not merely rhetorical. It is a cry from a psyche attempting to assert control over the uncontrollable. It is the mind's way of constructing boundaries, erecting walls against past trauma, shielding itself from the unpredictability of emotion. Similarly, those who claim, "everyone is against me," often feel isolated not because reality aligns with their statement, but because their inner world interprets subtle cues as threats, magnifying rejection, amplifying fear, and transforming ordinary social interactions into narratives of universal persecution. In both cases, extremity is the language of self-preservation, a way to assert clarity when clarity is absent, to impose certainty on a world experienced as volatile and unreliable. The philosophical undercurrent of these patterns is profound. Nietzsche repeatedly emphasized the paradox that what appears strongest is often the most fragile. Extremes in thought and language, in this light, are a kind of psychic overcompensation. The louder the proclamation of certainty, the more the mind is attempting to suppress doubt. The person who declares with absolute conviction that they always know what is right, is often navigating a labyrinth of ethical uncertainty, hesitant to acknowledge the ambiguity that defines human experience. The extremity of expression becomes a rehearsal for composure, a script designed to reassure both themselves and the world that they are whole, capable, and untouchable. And yet, for those attuned to nuance, the extremity becomes a signal. The louder the performance, the more pronounced the underlying tremor. Observe, 2. The rhythm of interaction. Extremes rarely emerge in isolation. They come in patterns, recurring phrases, and repeated emphases. The conversationalist who insists, "I never get angry," may do so multiple times within a discussion, as if repetition can enforce truth. The person who claims, "I am always happy," may punctuate unrelated statements with variations of this absolute, seeking to drown out evidence to the contrary. These repetitions, these linguistic insistences, are compensatory. They indicate that the mind is rehearsing a narrative to maintain equilibrium. Language becomes a method of control, an attempt to suppress the organic fluctuations of emotion, and the extremities themselves serve as markers for where the self is most vulnerable. In social observation, the implications are significant. Extremes in other speech can provide insight into motivations, fears, and inner conflicts that are otherwise hidden. They are not mere quirks of style. They are signals, clues to underlying fractures. The teacher who insists that all students must obey this rule may be negotiating anxiety over authority and control, projecting internal fears of chaos onto external structures. The colleague who declares, "I never compromise," may be expressing a deep-seated fear of appearing weak, a history of past vulnerability shaping present insistence. Even seemingly minor hyperbolic phrases, when viewed as a pattern, reveal the nervous scaffolding of the mind, the hidden calculus of insecurity that guides action and thought. Extremes also interact with emotion in complex ways. They are both a refuge and a trap. By speaking in absolutes, the mind creates the illusion of certainty, a temporary bastion against the unpredictable currents of life. Yet the more rigid the narrative, the more brittle it becomes. Reality seldom aligns with absolutes. Life is nuanced, mutable, and unpredictable. When experience inevitably challenges extreme claims, the mind experiences tension, discomfort, even a subtle cognitive dissonance. A person who insists, "I never make mistakes," is ill-prepared to navigate the minor errors and unforeseen setbacks that characterize daily existence. The extremity that once provided solace becomes a source of stress, forcing the mind to either adapt, recalibrate, or maintain the illusion at all costs, often through further repetition and increased forcefulness. This dynamic is intimately connected with the concept of projection. Extremes in speech often reveal what the speaker fears, but may not consciously recognize. The individual who claims, "I would never lie," may be unconsciously attuned to their own capacity for deceit, seeking to distance themselves from qualities they find intolerable in themselves. The one who proclaims, "Everyone is selfish," may be negotiating discomfort with their own self-interest, externalizing the tension in a narrative that patterns of extreme language often reflect developmental and emotional histories. A child who grew up in an environment of unpredictability may develop an adult voice defined by absolutes, a compensatory mechanism to assert control in a world previously experienced as capricious. A person who was frequently criticized for mistakes may become obsessed with perfection, framing behaviors and statements in extremes to maintain safety. Emotional wounds and unaddressed fears echo in the cadence of speech, and the absolutes are both the footprints of survival strategies and a roadmap to understanding the inner psyche. Observing these extremes is therefore not merely an exercise in psychology. It is a form of human archaeology, unearthing layers of experience, fear, and adaptation hidden beneath linguistic flourish. Yet extremes are not inherently pathological. They are part of the human repertoire, tools that mind and language employ to navigate uncertainty. They become concerning when habitual, when they dominate discourse, or when they are. There is a misconception that those who seek control possess strength, that the one who organizes every detail, micromanages outcomes, or imposes order upon the world, is powerful, steady, and confident. Yet, if you look closer, if you observe the rhythm of their actions, the compulsive need to manage, the relentless drive to predict and direct every circumstance, you begin to see that control is often the surface manifestation of something far more fragile. Control is not power. It is panic, tightly wound into habits, behaviors, and attitudes that project mastery while concealing chaos. The person who insists on order is frequently the person most terrified of disorder, the one who believes that if they loosen their grip, the internal universe will collapse. Every schedule, every directive, every carefully calibrated interaction is an armor, a barricade against the unpredictable, a desperate measure to contain the swirling disorder that exists within. Consider how the anxious mind perceives the world. For someone gripped by inner panic, even the smallest unpredictability, a delayed response, a missed cue, a sudden change, feels like a crack in the dam, threatening to flood the fragile landscape of their self-assured facade. The need for control is not merely a preference. It is a psychological necessity born from fear. It is a mechanism designed to hold chaos at bay, an attempt to externalize what the mind cannot yet stabilize internally. And yet, the more rigid the outward behavior, the more pronounced the tremors within. There is a paradox here. The tighter the grip on the external world, the more evident the internal instability. The compulsion to control is not an expression of strength but a confession of vulnerability, a reflection of the panic that simmers beneath the surface of apparent confidence. Imagine a person who cannot tolerate lateness, who insists that every meeting, every plan, every relationship proceed according to meticulous design. At first glance, this appears to be discipline, organization, responsibility. Yet beneath the surface lies a trembling awareness that the world is not fully controllable, that life is inherently unpredictable. Every effort to orchestrate outcomes, to mold the external environment into predictability, is a manifestation of an inner storm. The world becomes a canvas onto which anxiety is projected, and control is the brush used to paint order over disarray. The greater the fear, the more elaborate the painting, the more intricate the rituals, the more desperate the insistence on compliance. The facade may appear serene, but each gesture, each directive, each insistence on correctness is a pulse of inner panic-seeking expression. Control manifests in many forms, and each form is a mirror of internal chaos. Some seek control through perfectionism, attempting to ensure that every action, every detail, conforms to their vision of flawless execution. Others seek control through dominance, imposing rules and expectations upon others to create an illusion of stability. Some control time itself, crafting rigid schedules to impose order upon the unpredictable flow of events. The methods differ, yet the underlying motive is identical: the need to secure oneself against the unknown, to prevent internal disorder from spilling into external reality. It is a silent plea, often unconscious, for safety, certainty, and protection. And paradoxically, it is precisely the act of controlling that exposes the fragility beneath. One of the most revealing aspects of control is its relentless consumption of attention. The controlling mind is perpetually scanning, calculating, adjusting, correcting. Every movement of the external world is assessed for risk, every interaction weighed for potential disruption. There is little room for spontaneity, for uncertainty, for the natural rhythm of life to unfold. Control becomes a full-time occupation, a constant monitoring system, and yet it never guarantees security. The person may organize, direct, and dominate, but internal panic cannot be fully eradicated by external order. Chaos, like water beneath a dam, presses against the walls, ready to seep through, and the vigilant mind is forever alert to the tremors. Observe the body as well as the behavior. Control is often accompanied by tension, a tightened jaw, a rigid posture, restless hands, or rapid speech. These physical manifestations echo the psychological state: a nervous vigilance, a low-level anxiety, a body attuned to anticipate disruption. The person may speak calmly, issue instructions with precision, or present a composed front, yet the physicality betrays the undercurrent of panic. There is a rhythm to their movement, a pattern to their interaction, that hints at a mind constantly negotiating with potential disorder. The body, the language, the habits, all are extensions of the inner need to control, all are signals to the attentive observer of the underlying turbulence. Control also expresses itself through relationships. The controlling individual often struggles with trust, projecting internal uncertainty onto others. They may micromanage collaborators, scrutinize partners, or direct children with a strict hand. Beneath this behavior lies fear. The fear that others' choices may destabilize the carefully constructed order, that unpredictability in another's actions will provoke internal collapse. It is not malice. It is the projection of one's own fragility onto the external world. Relationships become a battleground for control, an arena in which inner panic is temporarily contained by exerting influence over the behavior of others. The more they attempt to impose control, the more evident the anxiety that fuels it. The paradox of control is that it can never truly contain life. Life, by its very nature, is mutable, unpredictable, and resistant to absolute mastery. No plan is ever perfect, no schedule immune to disruption, no person fully compliant to another's expectations. The act of trying to impose order is an acknowledgement that the world is, at its core, uncontrollable. And yet, this acknowledgement is rarely conscious. Instead, the mind generates systems, protocols, rules, and habits, attempting to transform external reality into a reflection of internal desire. Control is the illusion of security, a mask that conceals the truth, that life is uncertain, and in understanding control as a form of panic, one can begin to shift perspective. The controlling individual is not an antagonist or an obstacle to navigate. They are a mirror reflecting a universal human truth, that the mind seeks safety, and that fear often masquerades as strength. Observing control in action allows one to see the fracture between appearance and reality, between the projected mastery and the underlying vulnerability. Compassion emerges naturally when this distinction is understood. One realizes that attempts to control are attempts to survive, not exercises in power. They are expressions of a mind negotiating with its own instability, of a person attempting to maintain coherence against forces that feel overwhelming. Control also offers insight into the self. Reflecting on one's own need for control reveals the anxieties that drive behavior, the vulnerabilities that shape decisions, and the fears that influence choices. Each habit of control, each meticulous plan, each insistence on predictability, carries information about what the mind perceives as dangerous, uncertain, or intolerable. Recognizing this pattern in oneself is an act of awareness and growth. It allows the observer to disentangle fear from action, to discern when behavior is motivated by anxiety versus deliberate choice, and to cultivate flexibility in the face of life's inherent uncertainty. Consider how control interacts with creativity, spontaneity, and emotional intimacy. The controlling mind often struggles with these aspects of life because they are inherently unpredictable. Creativity requires improvisation, spontaneity resists planning, and emotional intimacy exposes one to vulnerability. Each of these domains challenges the illusion of control, highlighting the tension between internal desire for stability and the external reality of flux. The person attempting to control may find discomfort, resistance, or fear in these areas, revealing the inner panic that underpins behavior. Recognizing this allows for compassion both toward oneself and toward others who struggle with the same tension. Ultimately, control is a language of fear. The person seeking to dominate circumstances, dictate outcomes, or impose order is speaking a silent narrative, I am afraid of what will happen if I do not intervene. I am afraid of chaos, uncertainty, and collapse. I am afraid of the world and the fragility within myself. Every gesture, every insistence, every meticulously calculated move is an attempt to translate internal panic into observable behavior, to make disorder legible and manageable. And while control may offer temporary relief, it is never a permanent solution. The underlying turbulence persists, demanding attention, observation, and, eventually, reconciliation. Recognizing control as panic transforms perception. The observer can see beyond behavior to the hidden motivation, the emotional substratum that fuels action. They can differentiate between the illusion of strength and the reality of vulnerability, between outward dominance and inward tremor. This understanding fosters grace in interaction, patience in engagement, and depth in connection. Rather than reacting to control with frustration or opposition, one can respond with insight, empathy, and measured presence. One begins to perceive the human mind not merely as a set of actions, but as a dynamic system negotiating with uncertainty, vulnerability, and survival instinct. Control is a paradox. It is both an armor and a signal, both a defense and a confession. The more rigid, meticulous, and exacting the behavior, the more it reveals the instability it attempts to conceal. Observing these behaviors is not about judgment. It is about perception. It is about listening to the unspoken story behind actions, discerning the hidden fears that shape choices, and recognizing the shared human need to survive, adapt. If you spend time observing human interaction, you will notice the subtle performances that play out every day, not just on stages or in meetings, but in homes, cafes, online platforms, and the quiet corridors of intimate relationships. These performances are not entertainment. They are signals, each movement, each carefully curated word, a message that speaks of longing, insecurity, and a desperate need to be recognized. Performance is not merely vanity. It is a psychological lifeline, a method of reaching out to a world that feels indifferent, a way to assert presence in a space where one fears invisibility. Those who perform tirelessly are often those who feel most unworthy of the calm, quiet love that requires no embellishment, no applause, no verification. Consider the social media influencer who updates hourly, the colleague who insists on being seen in every meeting, or the friend who always must be the funniest, the cleverest, the most radiant. On the surface, these behaviors appear confident, even self-assured. But beneath this apparent mastery lies a hunger, a gnawing emptiness that can rarely be fully acknowledged. Every post, every quip, every laugh meticulously timed, is a method of bridging the perceived gap between themselves and the acceptance they crave. Life becomes a constant performance, where the mask is not merely decorative, it is essential. The mask says, silently but insistently, "Notice me. See me. Love me even if I cannot allow myself to be vulnerable." This phenomenon is not new, nor is it confined to our digital age. Look at history. Poets, philosophers, and kings have all engaged in this act of social orchestration. The orator who spoke with fire, the monarch who wore gold and finery, the scholar who presented every argument with dazzling precision, all were performing. Their performance was not always a show of arrogance or vanity. It was a signal to the world that they, too, were worthy of attention, acknowledgement, and above all, love. In quieter moments, behind the velvet curtain or gilded crown, there often lay doubt, insecurity, and the relentless question, am I enough if I am not performing? Performance is a dialogue between the inner and outer worlds. The outer display becomes a substitute for the inner conversation the individual cannot sustain. They speak through gestures, clothing, tone, and posture, each carefully chosen to communicate stability, charisma, or intelligence. Yet the interior remains turbulent, haunted by uncertainty. The louder the outward signal, the more fragile the inner self feels. Performance is an attempt to amplify presence, to assert significance in a world that might otherwise overlook them. It is a paradox. By trying to be seen, the performer risks being misunderstood. By performing, they reveal the very hunger they attempt to conceal. The psychology behind performance is rooted in the fundamental human need for connection. Love, in its deepest form, requires no performance. It is calm, accepting, and unconditional. But for those who have learned early in life that love is conditional, contingent upon achievement, charm, compliance, or decorum, performance becomes a necessary survival tool. The child who received affection only when excelling academically, socially, or creatively internalizes a system of conditional validation. This system persists into adulthood, where the individual continues to perform, unconsciously or consciously, seeking the quiet love they fear is unavailable without effort or display. The consequences of perpetual performance are subtle but profound. The performer becomes entwined with the mask, struggling to separate authentic self from the curated projection. Every interaction carries the weight of evaluation. Am I performing well enough? Is my presence validated? Do they see me? The question is relentless, haunting every smile, every word, every gesture. And yet, the paradox is that no amount of performance can fully resolve this anxiety. Attention, approval, and recognition may arrive in abundance, but they provide only temporary relief. The core remains unsettled, seeking a love that does not demand enactment. Performance is also a mirror for society's role in shaping human behavior. Culture, peers, and institutions often reward visibility over authenticity, applauding charisma, innovation, and spectacle more than quiet reflection, empathy, or steady presence. In such a context, performance is not only an individual strategy but a socially reinforced necessity. To survive, to be acknowledged, to maintain self-esteem, individuals calibrate their behavior to match external expectations. Over time, this calibration can harden into habit, producing people whose default mode is performance, whose spontaneous self is subordinated to the version they believe the world will embrace. Psychologically, performance can be understood as both defense and cry for help. It defends against invisibility, rejection, and neglect, yet it simultaneously communicates a need, often unspoken and unrecognized, for genuine care and attention. The very behaviors that appear confident, radiant, or dazzling are, paradoxically, admissions of vulnerability. When someone dominates conversation, decorates their space, or curates every public expression, they are negotiating with internal emptiness. Every laugh, every compliment they offer, every brilliant observation is a bridge thrown across the chasm of self-doubt. Observing this with empathy allows one to see the humanity behind the performance. A mind in search of acknowledgement, a heart seeking comfort, a soul yearning to be understood. Performance is particularly evident in social rituals. Consider gatherings, celebrations, and ceremonies. Those most visible, most animated, or most perfect are often those who feel most at risk of being overlooked. They animate the space not merely to entertain but to ensure they are seen, that their existence is acknowledged, that they are valued. Their laughter, gestures, and speech are scaffolding, a constructed support that keeps insecurity from spilling into plain view. If you watch carefully, you notice pauses, repetition. Yet performance is not merely individual, it is relational. Humans perform not in isolation but in interaction with others, seeking feedback, reflection, and validation. When the response matches the expectation, the temporary illusion of stability and acceptance is reinforced. When it does not, anxiety intensifies and the performance escalates, becoming louder, more intricate, more consuming. There is an almost musical quality to this dynamic, with cues, responses, and improvisations creating a rhythm that masks inner turbulence. The performance is choreography of survival, a dance in which the performer hopes to secure the attention and care they fear they cannot receive quietly. The cost of perpetual performance is profound. Individuals may lose touch with their internal compass, becoming disconnected from their true preferences, desires, and emotions. Authenticity is gradually eroded as performance dominates, creating a feedback loop where the external mask dictates internal perception. Emotional intimacy becomes difficult because revealing the authentic self carries risk. The risk of rejection, misunderstanding, or invisibility. The performer develops strategies to mediate interactions, protect vulnerability, and maintain the facade. Over time, this pattern can solidify into identity, leaving the individual uncertain where the mask ends and the self begins. Performance is also a lens through which to observe universal human dynamics. If you reflect on your own tendencies, you may notice moments when you too have performed, consciously or unconsciously. Perhaps you have moderated your opinion, adjusted your tone, or amplified a trait to be noticed, admired, or loved. These moments are not shameful. They are evidence of the human mind navigating a social world that often rewards visibility over authenticity. Recognizing this in oneself cultivates humility and insight, while observing it in others fosters empathy and compassion. Performance is everywhere, and its presence is an invitation to deepen understanding of the fragile human heart. Importantly, performance can evolve into self-deception. When repeated long enough, the enacted persona begins to feel real. The performer begins to believe that the mask is the self, that approval validates internal worth, and that external applause confirms personal identity. This illusion reinforces the cycle. The more one performs, the more the authentic self is suppressed. The more suppressed, the more one performs. The louder the performance, the emptier the core becomes. Yet within this paradox lies an opportunity. By observing patterns, moments of tension, and subtle leaks of vulnerability, one can begin to discern the underlying hunger, the unfulfilled longing for love that does not require performance. Performance, ultimately, is a language of love, spoken through action rather than words. It is a message that says, I am here. I exist. I matter. Love me. The forms vary, the grandiose, the subtle, the comedic, the intellectual, the aesthetic. Each is a strategy to communicate presence and value. And yet, the audience often interprets these messages superficially, reading only brilliance, charm, or charisma, and missing the fragile heart beneath. Understanding performance as a cry for love transforms perception. It allows the observer to see beyond surface behaviors to the emotional needs they express. Through this lens, one begins to perceive performance not as arrogance or vanity, but as survival. It is an adaptive response to a world that sometimes seems indifferent, a method of ensuring presence, care, and acknowledgement. Compassion emerges. They say we are rational creatures, gifted with reason and logic, capable of solving problems, debating ideas, and weighing consequences. But if you've ever watched someone cling to a clearly broken relationship, defend a belief that no longer serves them, or sabotage an opportunity they've worked years for, you already know this isn't the whole story. Humans don't act from logic. They act from pain. And the deeper the wound, the more polished the illusion of rationality becomes. Every person you meet holds a private archive of hurt, moments they've buried, parts of themselves they've disowned, needs they've silenced for years just to belong, just to survive. And when pain is left unaddressed, it doesn't vanish. It mutates. It becomes ideology. It becomes personality. It becomes opinion masquerading as objectivity. When someone tells you what they believe, what they stand for, what they think is right or true, listen closely, not to their words but to their urgency. The edge in their voice, the rigidity in their stance, the inability to entertain other perspectives. Those are not signs of clarity but signs of injury. Because when a belief system is constructed to protect a wound, it is defended not with openness but with armor. It cannot be debated, because to challenge it is to threaten the scaffolding that holds the person together. Imagine a house built on uneven land. The foundation is cracked, but instead of fixing it, the owner adds layers upon layers. Stronger beams, decorative walls, louder colors, distractions. From the outside it looks impressive, but deep underneath, it is unsettled. That's how many people live. Their beliefs, their routines, even their personalities are built to obscure, not reveal, their foundations. They say, "I just don't believe in love," but what they mean is, "I loved once, deeply, and I was shattered." They say, "I don't need anyone," but what they mean is, "I needed someone and they left me." They say, "I'm just not emotional," but what they mean is, "Feeling too much once ruined me and I won't let that happen again." These aren't logical conclusions. They are emotional defense systems wearing the mask of stoicism. Nietzsche understood this well. He warned us not to mistake the arguments of the intellect for the clarity of the soul. Logic is too often used not to uncover the truth, but to protect it from being seen. And the more articulate someone is, the more skilled they may be at hiding. Pain doesn't always look like tears. Sometimes it looks like well-rehearsed theories, like sharp critiques, like cold analysis. A person who speaks in systems and categories may be trying to avoid stepping into the raw chaos of their own humanity. So many of us are not defending ideas. We are defending the fragile inner child who once needed something they never got. We argue fiercely because to surrender would mean revisiting a loss too great to name. And that's the great paradox of human intelligence. We use our most advanced faculties not to confront reality but to escape it. Reason then becomes a refuge for the wounded, a clean, structured world in which nothing bleeds and everything has an answer. But the human heart was never built to be clean. It's messy, contradictory, and full of longing. Consider how many political ideologies are born from personal grief. How many rigid moral codes began as an attempt to create safety in a chaotic childhood? How many career choices are shaped by a parent's absence? How many relationships are driven not by compatibility but by the hope to rewrite a painful past? We are not building futures, we are trying to repair history. And every decision we call rational must be examined under that light. This doesn't mean people are incapable of reason. It means reason is rarely the starting point. The starting point is always need. The need to feel safe, to feel wanted, to feel in control. And when those needs go unmet, the psyche constructs beliefs to make sense of the absence. Not because those beliefs are true but because they soothe. If someone tells you, "People always leave," that isn't an insight. That's a scar. If someone says, "I can't trust anyone," that's not wisdom. That's a story carved out of betrayal. People believe what helps them sleep at night, what makes their pain more tolerable, what keeps them from unraveling. So when you hear someone clinging to a worldview that seems illogical, ask yourself, what does this belief protect them from feeling? What would collapse if they let go of it? Often, the belief is the only thing standing between them and a memory they can't yet bear to process. We've all done this. We've all found ways to rationalize the things that hurt us. We say they didn't mean it, or it wasn't that bad, or I deserved it. We call it forgiveness, but often it's just suppression. We dress our trauma in intellectual clothing. We wrap shame in productivity. We silence grief with routines. And eventually we forget there was ever a wound at all. We only remember the shape it left behind. But wounds remembered or not still shape behavior. The person who avoids conflict at all costs might have grown up with explosive arguments. The one who always needs to win may have spent childhood losing to a parent's disappointment. The one who overworks might have learned early that their worth was transactional. These are not conscious strategies. They are patterns encoded deep in the psyche, directing lives from behind the curtain. And the more we call them just who I am, the harder it becomes to change them. That's why understanding this truth, that no one is rational, just wounded, is not an act of judgment but of mercy. It allows us to look at others not with contempt but with curiosity. The angry man is in pain. The cold woman is afraid. The narcissist is starving for a self they never got to become. Once you see that, everything changes. You stop arguing. You stop trying to win. You start listening, not to what they say but to what their wounds are trying to say through them. This awareness doesn't make you naive. It makes you precise. You stop wasting energy debating the surface and instead look deeper. You ask, what are they really protecting? What are they afraid will happen if they're wrong? What would it cost them to change? That's how you read someone, not by their words but by their defenses. Because people lie with words. They rarely lie with their fears. And this applies to you too. How many of your opinions are armor? How many of your routines are rituals of avoidance? How much of your confidence is compensation? What parts of yourself have you declared rational, simply because it was too painful to admit they were broken? There is no shame in this. There is only the choice to look inward with honesty. You are not weak because you built defenses. You are wise for realizing they no longer serve you. And the path to growth is not dismantling them overnight, but slowly peeling back the layers, asking yourself where each belief came from, and whether it still belongs in the person you are becoming. True reason emerges only after the pain has been acknowledged. Until then, what we call logic is often a beautiful, elaborate story designed to help us survive. But survival is not the same as living. And at some point, if you want peace, you must stop asking, is this rational? And start asking, is this still protecting me from something I no longer need to fear? Because no one is purely rational. We are stitched together with memory and longing, with loss and hope. And our greatest strength is not how well we argue, but how bravely we can sit with the parts of ourselves we were once too afraid to feel. The most powerful transformation begins not with intellect, but with tenderness, with the simple, quiet courage to say, I am not okay, but I am willing to understand why. That sentence will do more for your evolution than 1,000 books, 100 debates, or any polished theory ever could. It's not logic that will set you free. It's truth. And truth doesn't come through victory. It comes through surrender. You never truly know someone's strength by how they behave when they are winning, when they are admired, or when they are surrounded by people who can offer them something. You know someone's real power by how they treat the ones who are powerless, those who are broken, awkward, uncertain, ashamed, invisible. That's where the mask slips. That's where the soul is seen. The modern world often celebrates dominance. Power is equated with control, speed, sharpness, wealth, charisma. We idolize those who rise above, those who win, those who speak louder than the rest. But all of that can be mimicked. What cannot be faked is how a person responds to weakness. Because when no one is watching, when there's nothing to gain, when the other person has no influence or leverage, that's when the truth emerges. A man who is kind to his boss but cruel to the waiter is not kind. A woman who is generous to her followers but dismissive of her own child's tears is not generous. Real strength is revealed not in performance but in patience. Not in grandeur but in grace. Kindness is often misunderstood as softness, passivity, or even submission. But in reality, kindness is one of the most radical expressions of strength. To be kind requires restraint, humility, and presence. It means choosing connection over control, listening over dominance, understanding over judgment. It is not reactive, it is intentional. It does not seek applause, nor does it protect the ego. It simply is, like a quiet flame that does not need to roar to give light. When someone lashes out, the easiest thing to do is retaliate. When someone disappoints you, the natural response is to withdraw love. But kindness asks you to hold something harder, to remain open in the face of pain. Not foolishly, not naively, but bravely. With the clarity that your response says more about you than about them. Because cruelty is cheap. It takes nothing to break someone. You only need to point out their worst moment, raise your voice, slam a door, or walk away. But to stay, to witness someone's humanity in its most fragile form and still offer warmth, that is mastery. Most people were not taught this. We were taught that kindness must be earned, that love must be deserved, that respect is conditional. And so we ration our tenderness. We give it only to those who prove themselves worthy. But this scarcity mindset is not strength. It is fear. It says, if I give too much, I'll be taken advantage of. If I forgive too easily, I'll be hurt again. If I show kindness to someone who doesn't deserve it, I'll lose. But that's a misunderstanding of what kindness really is. Kindness is not a transaction. It is not a currency to be spent wisely. It is a declaration of sovereignty. It says, I do not need to match your behavior to feel whole. I do not need to punish you to prove my value. I choose grace not because of who you are, but because of who I am becoming. And this, perhaps, is the most difficult truth to live. That kindness is a form of power that refuses to humiliate. It sees weakness and does not exploit it. It sees confusion and does not mock it. It sees fear and does not use it as leverage. It simply offers space. And in that space, transformation can occur, not because you force someone to change, but because you allowed them to be seen. There is a kind of power that demands obedience. And then there is a kind of power that inspires trust. The first can dominate a room. The second can hold it. The first is loud. The second is quiet. The first threatens. The second remembers. It remembers what it's like to be small, uncertain, ashamed. It remembers that everyone has a moment when they need forgiveness, a moment when they are not at their best. And it asks, who do I want to be in that moment? Kindness, in its highest form, is not random acts or polite gestures. It is a philosophy. A choice to see the sacred in everyone even when they have forgotten it in themselves. And it does not mean tolerating harm or abandoning boundaries. On the contrary, it requires boundaries. It requires a strong inner core from which to offer presence without dissolving. Because true kindness is never self-sacrifice. It is self-possession in service of connection. Think of the person who forgave you before you forgave yourself. The friend who didn't walk away when you were difficult to love. The stranger who gave you dignity when you had nothing to offer. Did they lose power in that moment? Or did they show you something about what power can be? In Nietzschean terms, this is the overcoming of ressentiment, the bitter, reactive morality that seeks to make others pay for our pain. Nietzsche saw true power not in domination but in creation. In the ability to transform suffering into strength, and strength into presence. Kindness, then, is not weakness. It is the final stage of the inner war. It is the moment after revenge is no longer interesting. After righteousness has been exhausted. After control has become a cage. Kindness is what remains when you are no longer fighting yourself. And it must begin there. Because how you treat your own weaknesses is how you will treat others. If you punish your failures with shame, you will shame others for theirs. If you cannot forgive the parts of you that are messy or lost, you will be harsh with others who reflect those same qualities. But if you can hold your own pain with gentleness, not indulgence, not justification, but compassion, then you can do the same for the world. This is why the kindest people are not the most comfortable. They are often the most scarred. They've been through things that broke them open. And instead of becoming cynical, they became tender. Instead of closing, they widened. Instead of using their pain as an excuse to harm others, they turned it into a bridge. That is strength. And the world needs more of it. Not performative niceness. Not moral superiority disguised as charity. But real, quiet, unshakable kindness. The kind that sits with someone in their grief and doesn't try to fix it. The kind that holds space for someone's anger without making it about, and there is no power greater than that. They walk through the world like everyone else, sipping coffee, sending emails, smiling for photos, saying, "Have a good one." They answer questions with practiced ease, wear clothes that signal who they want to be, and keep their voices even in polite conversation. But underneath, there's a wound walking. That's what most people are. Not a fixed personality. Not a clean, tidy story. But a wound that hasn't closed, wearing layers of behavior like gauze. Every eye roll, every overreaction, every withdrawal, every overly sunny greeting is not just a social gesture. It's often scar tissue. It's a map of how they survived something they didn't have the tools to name. If you've ever looked at someone and thought, "Why would they do that?" Pause. That moment of confusion is your clue. What you're seeing doesn't make sense logically because it's not logic you're witnessing. It's memory. Memory that lives in the body, not just in the mind. You're watching them react to something that already happened, but that still echoes in the now. This is the great misreading we all commit, thinking we are interacting with a person when in fact, we are interacting with their unresolved story. The behaviors that confuse us the most, avoidance, aggression, self-sabotage, are not mistakes. They're the body's way of saying, "This is where I bled once. This is where it still hurts." We assume people are hiding from us, but often they're hiding from themselves. That's why their reactions feel disproportionate. Why one small comment can cause them to shut down. Why they can't explain why they overwork or over-apologize or disappear just when things feel good. The reason isn't in the moment. It's buried in the emotional geology of years past, a fossil of fear still shaping how they move. People are not walking around speaking truth. They're repeating what once kept them safe. You say something kind to them and they flinch. Why? Because the kindness doesn't match their self-story. If they've carried the belief that they are unworthy, your warmth doesn't feel comforting. It feels foreign, suspicious, unsafe. It contradicts the internal narrative that kept them emotionally alive, and so, it gets rejected. You offer closeness and they withdraw. Not because they don't care, but because closeness once meant pain. Trust was a door that opened to betrayal. So now they keep it shut. Not out of malice but out of memory. You try to reason with them and they won't budge. Not because they're stubborn but because your logic speaks to the mind while their resistance lives in the wound. You're having a conversation in the wrong language. This is where grace becomes necessary. Because once you understand that people are not behaving, they're bleeding, you stop expecting rationality from pain. You stop taking the confusion personally. You stop demanding that others make sense when their life never did. You begin to see that their overreaction is really a memory trying to defend itself. That their silence is not indifference, but a dam holding back tears they were never allowed to cry. That their control is not cruelty, but a survival mechanism from a world where unpredictability once meant danger. And if you can hold this in your awareness, this truth that everyone is a walking wound, you begin to read people differently. Not as problems to fix or puzzles to solve, but as systems of meaning, systems of protection, systems of hope, grief, and fragile belief. The man who mocks emotions isn't heartless. He's terrified of his own. He grew up where feelings were punished or dismissed, so he learned to wear a mask of sarcasm instead of a soul. The woman who needs to be needed all the time isn't clingy. She's still trying to earn the love that was conditional in her childhood. Her helping isn't just generosity, it's negotiation for belonging. The person who always changes the subject when it gets vulnerable isn't avoiding you, they're avoiding their own mirror. Because in that reflection, there are feelings they don't have the tools to hold. The person who yells doesn't feel powerful. They feel small. And the sound of their voice growing louder is their attempt to silence the fear inside. People don't show you who they are. They show you who they learn to be. They show you their strategy, not their soul. But if you watch closely, if you quiet your assumptions and soften your gaze, you can sometimes catch a glimpse. In the hesitation before a response. In the way they avoid eye contact. In the sigh that says more than their words. You're not reading behavior. You're reading biography. That's the final truth of all of this. Not just this chapter, but the entire journey. The mask, the performance, the lies, the control, the extremes, the criticism, the silence, the virtue, the confidence, the fear. It's all a story. A layered, complicated, painful story that most people haven't read themselves. So how could they explain it to you? But the patterns tell you everything. And if you've come this far, if you've walked through all these chapters with your mind open and your heart curious, you now know how to listen. Not just with your ears, but with your attention, with your intuition, with your grace. You've learned to see the mask, but not judge it. To spot projection, but not retaliate. To hold someone's silence, but not punish it. To see past arrogance into the child it protects. To translate fear into motive. To read someone's performance as a cry for love. And now, finally, you understand that behind every adult is a child. Still trying to feel safe. Still trying to be good enough. Still trying to rewrite an old story with new tools. So when someone lies, when someone withdraws, when someone lashes out or shuts down, ask not what's wrong with them, but what happened to them? And when you catch yourself doing the same, when you feel yourself slipping into performance, silence, control, or retreat, ask not what's wrong with me, but what am I afraid of repeating? That's the shift. That's the mirror. Because in learning to read others, you've actually been reading yourself. The things that annoy you in others. And as you move back into your life, back into conversations and conflicts and quiet moments, you now have a new lens. A lens that doesn't reduce people to behavior, but elevates them to story, to memory, to resilience, to raw, aching humanity. Everyone you meet is a mirror. Everyone you meet is a biography in progress. And most of what you'll read, they haven't written consciously. But you'll see it in the patterns, in the pauses, in the places they break. So when you read someone now, read slowly. Read kindly. Read with your whole self. Because behind that face is a wound. And behind that wound is a soul. And behind that soul is a child who still hopes to be loved without having to earn it. You are not just reading people. You are holding them. And how you read, how you interpret, how you respond, is now your deepest act of grace. Now you understand. Now you see. Now you can begin. And now we slow down. We've walked far, haven't we? Through the masks, the fractures, the projections, the pain. Through the subtle silences and the thunderous performances. Through the ways we hide and the ways we cry for love, without ever saying a word. But you're here. You made it through. So, close your eyes if you haven't already. Feel the weight of your body sink just a little deeper into the bed or the couch or wherever you've chosen to listen. Let gravity do the rest. You don't need to hold anything right now. Not answers, not posture, not even thoughts. Let them all go. You don't need to solve anyone tonight. Not them, not yourself. You don't need to improve, transform, or prove a thing. Because right now, for these next few minutes, the world is soft and your soul is safe. This was never a manual for control. It was never about learning to manipulate or decode others like some emotionless cipher. No, this has always been about returning. Returning to a deeper seeing. A slower breath. A more patient kind of truth. There is nothing urgent about healing. The wound you carry doesn't need to close tonight. The pattern you've noticed doesn't need to vanish by morning. This is not a race, and there are no final exams in self-awareness. Only practice. Only presence. So tonight, practice resting. Let your mind drift, like a candle floating on dark water. No direction, no goal, just presence. Let thoughts pass like clouds. Let memories soften like fog. Let all the voices inside you hush just a little. Because here's something you may need to hear, perhaps even more than everything else we've said. You are not behind. You are not broken. You are not too late. Whatever wounds you carry, whatever patterns you've repeated, they are not indictments. They are evidence that you survived. And surviving is a sacred thing. That version of you that performed for love, that worked too hard, stayed too long, stayed too silent, tried too much, they were doing the best they knew how. You don't have to resent them. You don't have to throw them away. You can thank them. You can gently take their hand and say, I've got it from here. That child inside you, yes, the one still flinching, still reaching, still hoping, deserves to sleep in peace tonight. They've earned it. And you, the adult who's been carrying them, you've earned it too. There's a strange peace that comes when you stop needing people to behave differently in order to feel okay. When you can witness someone's wound without absorbing it. When you can recognize their chaos as theirs, not yours to fix. That's not coldness. That's clarity. And clarity is what grace is made of. Imagine that. A world where you can walk into any room, any conversation, and not take things personally. A world where you can see someone lash out, not as an attack but as a confession of fear. A world where your first response is curiosity, not control. Compassion, not defensiveness. That's the world you're building now. Inside yourself. And slowly, like morning light touching the edge of a curtain, it begins to spill outward. Because something happens when you begin to see clearly. You soften. You forgive what you once could not understand. You hold what you once needed to fix. You rest where you once had to run. You become a refuge, not just for others but for yourself. So take a breath. Feel it, not just in your lungs but in your shoulders, your spine, your chest. Let it unravel the tension that built up while you weren't even noticing. Let it tell your nervous system, we are safe. We are okay. We are home now. This is the quiet beneath the noise. This is the part of you that doesn't need to be explained. This is the part of you that was never broken. And maybe, just maybe, this is the part of you someone will meet someday. Not your mask, not your performance, but you. The you that doesn't have to work so hard to be worthy. The you that trusts softness. The you that isn't afraid to be seen fully and still feel loved. You don't need to earn rest. You don't need to earn love. You don't need to earn the right to begin again. All of it is already yours. So tonight, let go of the stories. Let go of the performance. Let go of the should. There is nothing left to do right now but close your eyes and trust the silence. Let the night hold you like an old friend. Let sleep come without permission. Let your breath be your lullaby. And when tomorrow comes, you'll wake with new eyes. Not because the world changed, but because you did. Just a little. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but in the quietest way possible. With less armor. With more seeing. With a gentler rhythm in your chest. You've been reading people your whole life. Now you're reading them differently. Now you're reading with grace. And maybe, just maybe, that's the beginning of everything. Sleep well, my friend. You are safe. You are whole. You are already enough. Everything else can wait until morning.